Chief Warrant Officer Elena Vance was gutting a rainbow trout on the scarred wooden bench behind her cabin in Darby, Montana, when the static from the old PRC 150 on her porch shifted from the white noise of a mountain storm to the rhythmic, three-beat pulse of a dead man's signal. It was a Tuesday, the kind of day where the air smells like damp pine and wood smoke, and the only thing on her mind was whether the frost would kill her late-season tomatoes. She didn't drop the knife. Her hands, calloused from 3 winters of hauling split logs and 5 years of pulling heavy wire through the dark corners of the world, remained perfectly still. The fish was slick and silver in her left hand, the blade buried near the gills. She didn't look at the radio immediately. She looked at the Bitterroot Range, the peaks capped in a premature dusting of September snow, and she counted the beats. 1, 2, 3. A pause that lasted exactly 5 seconds. Then the sequence repeated. It was the vagabond key, a specific jittered frequency hopping pattern that had been officially retired, encrypted, and buried in a burn bag at Fort Huachuca 4 years ago. It was a ghost calling from a grave she had helped dig. She finished the cut. It was a clean, surgical opening of the trout's belly. She reached inside, her fingers working with a detached, clinical efficiency that had once been her greatest asset and was now her quietest curse. She rinsed the fish in the bucket of ice-melt water, the red clouding the clear surface for a moment before settling. Only then did she wipe her hands on her canvas apron, the movement slow and deliberate. She stood up, her back straight, a posture that 30 years of civilian life would never be able to slouch, and walked toward the porch. The radio was an antique by modern standards, a bulky green box that looked like a relic of a different era, but its internals were something else entirely. She had rebuilt it herself, using parts scavenged from surplus bins in Missoula and black market processors she'd ordered through dead-drop addresses in Virginia. To the neighbors in Darby, she was just Laney, the quiet veteran who fished the Bitterroot and kept her grass cut short. They thought she had retired quietly, a woman who'd spent her time in some windowless room in D.C., and finally had enough of the humidity. They had no idea that the woman who sold them huckleberry jam at the Saturday market was the only person on the continent who knew that the sound coming from that speaker meant the world was about to catch fire. Elena leaned over the radio, her ear catching the minute fluctuations in the signal's gain. She didn't need a spectrum analyzer to see what she was hearing. To Elena, sound had never just been noise. It was architecture. When she closed her eyes, she could see the waveforms as physical structures, the jagged peaks of interference, the smooth valleys of a clean carrier wave, the sharp, artificial edges of a man-made pulse. She had been born with it, a freakish bit of neurowiring that the Army had spent $3 million refining. In the windowless sifts of her youth, they called it the ear. It wasn't just that she could hear a needle drop in a hurricane. It was that she could tell you the brand of the needle and the wind speed of the storm by the way the sound interacted with the air. She listened now, her breath held in her chest as the 3-beat pulse shifted. A voice broke through. It was distorted, shredded by layers of encryption and the sheer distance it had traveled, but the cadence was unmistakable. It wasn't the words that mattered yet. It was the way the speaker breathed between the syllables, a sharp inhale, a clipped delivery. Elysium, this is Pale Horse. The gate is open. I repeat, the gate is open. The voice was thin like paper being torn, but it resonated in Elena's marrow. She knew that voice. She had buried the man who owned it in a ceremony at Arlington, where the casket was weighted with sandbags, because there hadn't been enough of Major Elias Thorne left to fill a shoebox. That was 3 years ago, in a valley that didn't exist on any map, during an operation that the Department of Defense claimed never happened. She reached out, her hand hovering over the dial. Her fingers didn't tremble, but the skin around her knuckles was white. This was the moment where she was supposed to call the sheriff, or the FBI, or the old number for the duty officer at the 304th Military Intelligence Battalion. But she did none of those things. Elena Vance knew better than anyone that if Elias Thorne was speaking on the vagabond frequency, the people she was supposed to call were either dead or they were the ones who had opened the gate. She lived alone, by design. The cabin was a 4-room structure of cedar and stone, tucked 3 miles back from the nearest paved road. The interior was sparse, smelling of cedar oil and gun solvent. There were no photos of her time in the service, no medals on the walls, no "I served" bumper stickers on her 2004 Tacoma. The only evidence of her past was a single, framed topographical map of the Chugach Mountains and a dog named Scout. Scout was a Belgian Malinois who had been retired from the K-9 Corps for the same reason Elena had been retired from the Army. He saw things other people missed, and it made him difficult to manage. He was sitting by the screen door now, his head cocked to the side, his ears swiveling toward the radio. He didn't bark. He just watched Elena with those intelligent amber eyes, waiting for the command that would tell him the piece was over. Elena walked back into the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under her boots. She was 52 years old, but she moved with the coiled economy of a woman who expected a threat from every doorway. She had grown up in Olween, Iowa, a town where the most exciting thing that happened was the freight train passing through at 3 o'clock a.m. Her father had been a signalman for the Union Pacific, and she used to sit with him on the porch, listening to the tracks. He taught her how to tell a loaded coal train from an empty grain hauler just by the vibration in the wood beneath her feet. "Everything has a song, El," he'd say, tapping his pipe against the railing. "You just have to learn the lyrics." She had learned them. She had learned them so well that by the time she was 22, she was being recruited by agencies that didn't have names. Her career hadn't been built on bravado or the kind of cinematic heroism they put in recruitment ads. It had been built in the dark, in the quiet, in the spaces between the lines. She was the one they brought in when the satellites couldn't see through the cloud cover and the ground sensors were being jammed. She could sit in a room with a headset for 18 hours and pick out the sound of a specific truck engine idling 5 miles away in a city of 6 million people. She was a ghost who tracked ghosts. But the Army, for all its talk of innovation, had a ceiling for women who didn't play the political games of the officer corps. She had reached that ceiling when she was a chief warrant officer too, sitting in a debriefing room at Fort Huachuca, telling a room full of colonels that the insurgent cell they were tracking wasn't a cell at all, but a state-sponsored shadow unit using stolen U.S. encryption. "You're seeing patterns where there are none, Vance," Colonel Holloway had said, his voice dripping with the kind of condescending patience one uses with a child or a particularly stubborn mule. He was a man who liked his intelligence to be tidy, preferably delivered in a PowerPoint presentation with clear, color-coded arrows. "The signal is erratic because they are using outdated equipment. It's noise, nothing more." "It's not noise, sir," Elena had replied, her voice flat, her eyes fixed on the map behind his head. She didn't beg, she didn't raise her voice. "It's a polyalphabetic cipher disguised as thermal noise. They're talking right through our own jamming. If we move the 3rd platoon into that valley, they're walking into a slaughterhouse." Holloway hadn't listened. He'd signed the order, and 36 hours later, 3rd platoon had been erased. The official report blamed a failure of local intelligence and unforeseen atmospheric interference. Elena had been the one to sit in the SIF and listen to the final transmissions. She had heard the screams, yes, but more importantly, she had heard the silence that followed, a silence that had a specific artificial hum, the hum of a job being finished. When she tried to file a dissenting after-action report, the paperwork had vanished. 2 weeks later, her security clearance was under review for a clerical error that didn't exist. A month after that, she was offered an early retirement package. It was a polite way of saying, "Get out before we find a reason to court-martial you for being right." She had taken the package, she had bought the cabin, she had told herself she was done with the songs and the lyrics. But the PRC 150 didn't care about her retirement. It continued to pulse, the 3-beat rhythm echoing through the small house. Elena went to the hallway closet and pulled a heavy Pelican brand case from the top shelf. She set it on the dining table, the latches snapping open with a sound like a rifle bolt closing. Inside wasn't a weapon, at least not a conventional one. It was a high-gain, tactical SIGINT suite, a black box she'd built from the ground up during her first year in Montana. She hadn't been able to help herself. It was like a surgeon keeping a set of scalpels in the garage, just in case. She began to connect the cables, her movements fluid and practiced. She bypasses the standard Montana power grid, hooking the unit into a set of deep-cycle marine batteries she kept under the floorboards. She needed a clean draw, no spikes, no ripples. She donned a pair of professional-grade headphones, the kind that sealed out every external sound, and suddenly the cabin vanished. The birds outside, the wind in the pines, the ticking of the clock, all of it was gone. There was only the signal. She dived into it. Her fingers danced across the frequency dial, not turning it but feathering it, feeling for the edges of the vagabond hop. It was like trying to catch a specific raindrop in a thunderstorm. The signal was jumping across 600 different frequencies every second, a mathematical dance designed to be invisible to anything but the authorized receiver. But Elena knew the math. She had written the original algorithm for Vagabond back when she was a young technician at Meade. She knew the flaws. She knew the stutter in the code that the designers had missed, a tiny 3-millisecond hang time every 10th hop. She caught it. The audio cleared. The distortion dropped away, replaced by the hollow metallic ring of a satellite bounce. The protocol is 7 Delta. Repeat, 7 Delta. If you are hearing this, the clock has already started. We are at the extraction point 0. Any unit within range, the package is hot. I repeat, the package is hot. Elena felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. 7 Delta wasn't just a protocol. It was a scorched earth directive. It meant that a deep cover asset had been compromised and was carrying something so sensitive that the only options were extraction or total annihilation of the site. And extraction point 0. That was a location that had been scrubbed from the records. It was a decommissioned Cold War bunker buried under the shale and granite of the Pioneer Mountains, less than 200 miles from where she was standing. She took off the headphones. The silence of the cabin rushed back in, feeling heavy and suffocating. She looked at Scout. The dog was standing now, his hackles raised, a low growl vibrating in his throat. He could feel it too, the shift in the atmosphere, the end of the quiet life. "He's dead, Scout," she whispered, the words sounding alien in the empty room. "Elias is dead. I saw the casualty report. I saw the flag on the coffin." But her ears didn't lie. Her ears had never lied. The voice on the radio had the exact sibilance of Elias Thorne's speech, the slight whistle on the S that came from a piece of shrapnel he'd taken in the jaw in Jalalabad. It wasn't a recording. It was live, and it was coming from a place where nobody was supposed to be. Elena didn't hesitate. She didn't weigh the risks to her pension or her freedom. The mission didn't end just because the army told you it did. She walked to the gun safe in the corner and punched in the code. She didn't reach for a hunting rifle. She reached for the suppressed SIG Sauer P-226 she'd kept in a grease cloth under the false bottom of the safe. She checked the slide, the sound of the brass chambering around the only punctuation in her decision. She grabbed a tactical vest, a set of night vision goggles, and a ruggedized laptop. She was halfway to the door when the phone on the wall rang. She froze. Nobody had this number except the local power company and Miller, the retired master sergeant who lived down the road. She let it ring once. Twice. On the third ring, she picked it up. She didn't say hello. "Laney." It was Miller. His voice was tight, the casual Montana drawl replaced by the clipped tone of a man who had spent 20 years in the Rangers. "You hearing the birds?" "I hear them, Miller," she said. "They're not supposed to be singing that song," Miller said. "I've got 3 blacked-out Suburbans moving fast up the 93. They're not local and they're not tourists. They've got government plates, but the markings are wrong. They're heading toward the trailhead at Sawtooth." "That's the back way to the Pioneers," Elena said, her mind already mapping the terrain. "How far out?" 10 minutes from your turnoff," Miller said. "Laney, what the hell is going on? That frequency. That's Gray 7, isn't it? The one we were told to forget." "It's Elias, Miller," she said. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Miller had been there too. He'd been the one who pulled Elena out of the wreckage when the valley went south. He'd been the one who held the Roman 4 bag while she tried to stop Elias's bleeding. "Elias is in the ground, Laney," Miller said, his voice cracking. "Then there's a ghost in the Pioneers," Elena said, "and I'm the only one who knows how to talk to it." "They'll kill you," Miller said. "If those Suburbans are who I think they are, they're not coming for an extraction. They are coming for a cleanup." "I know," Elena said. She looked at the trout on the bench outside, the silver skin dulling in the afternoon light. "Tell the sheriff there's a cougar sighting near the ridge. Keep the locals off the mountain." "Laney," she hung up. She didn't have time for a goodbye. She grabbed her keys and the Pelican case and stepped out into the cool mountain air. The world felt different now. The shadows under the trees looked deeper. The silence of the mountains no longer felt like peace. It felt like a bated breath. She loaded the gear into the back of the Tacoma, Scout leaping into the passenger seat without being told. She didn't start the engine immediately. She sat there for a moment, her hands on the wheel, her eyes closed. She listened. In the far distance, past the wind and the rustle of the leaves, she heard it. The low, rhythmic thrum of heavy engines, 3 of them moving in sync. They were pushing hard, the tires humming against the asphalt of the 93. They were professionals, they were fast. But they didn't know the mountain, and they didn't know Elena Vance. She started the truck and backed out of the drive, the gravel crunching under her tires. She didn't turn toward the highway. She turned toward the old logging roads that wound through the Bitterroot National Forest, a labyrinth of dirt and rock that didn't appear on any GPS. She knew every inch of it. She had spent 3 years learning the acoustics of these canyons, how the sound of an engine would bounce off the granite walls and where the dead zones were. As she drove, her mind was a blur of data and memory. Why now? Why Elias? The gate he'd mentioned. It was a reference to the Gateway Project, a black-budget initiative that dealt with the interception of foreign deep space communications. It was supposed to have been shuttered after the disaster in the valley. If the gate was open, it meant they had found something, or something had found them. The truck bounced over a deep rut, the suspension groaning. Elena ignored it, her focus entirely on the mental map of the pioneers. The bunker at Extraction Point Zero was a relic of the 50s, a massive concrete honeycomb built into the side of a mountain to house the regional command in the event of a nuclear strike. It was supposed to be empty, stripped of its gear and sealed with 10-ton blast doors. But supposed to be was a phrase that didn't carry much weight in Elena's world. She reached the first ridge and pulled over, killing the engine and the lights. She grabbed her binoculars and looked down toward the 93. Through a gap in the trees, she saw them, 3 black subs, moving like a funeral procession at 80 miles an hour. They didn't have their sirens on, but they were ignoring the speed limits. They reached the Sawtooth trailhead and turned off, their taillights disappearing into the dust. Elena checked her watch. They had a 20-minute lead on the main road, but she had a shortcut through the Devil's Throat, a narrow, terrifying pass that most people wouldn't take in a Jeep, let alone a 20-year-old pickup. "Hold on, Scout," she murmured. She slammed the truck into 4 low and crested the ridge. The descent was a blur of white-knuckle steering and engine braking. The Tacoma slid sideways on the loose shale, the back end hanging over a 300-foot drop, but Elena didn't flinch. She felt the vibration of the tires, the grip of the rubber on the rock. She was part of the machine, her ear tuned to the sound of the differential and the strain on the axles. She reached the bottom of the pass in 6 minutes, cutting 15 miles off the trip. She was now ahead of the Suburbans, but she was on a parallel track. She needed to reach the bunker before they did. She needed to know what Elias was holding. The sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the landscape. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 10 minutes. Elena turned on her NVGs, the world turning into a grainy, luminous green. She drove without headlights, relying on her memory and the ghostly image in her goggles. The woods were thick here, the trees crowding the narrow track, their branches scraping against the sides of the truck like skeletal fingers. She reached the base of the Pioneer Peak an hour later. The bunker entrance was hidden behind a stand of old-growth Douglas firs, protected by a chain-link fence that had long since rusted through. She parked the truck in a thicket of brush and covered it with a camouflage net. She checked her gear one last time, radio, laptop, SIG, extra mags. She looked at Scout. "Stay," she commanded, her voice a low vibration. The dog whined, a tiny sound of protest, but he hunkered down in the footwell. He knew his job. He was the early warning system. If anyone approached the truck, he would be a shadow with teeth. Elena moved toward the bunker. She didn't use a flashlight. She moved by touch and sound, her boots making almost no noise on the pine needle-covered ground. She reached the blast door. It was a massive slab of steel, partially obscured by vines and dirt. It looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. But when Elena pressed her ear against the cold metal, she didn't hear the silence of a tomb. She heard a hum, a high-frequency, 60-cycle hum. Power. The bunker was live. She felt a surge of that old, familiar adrenaline, the dark competence that had defined her life before the cabin. Her hands moved to the keypad hidden behind a rusted plate. It was an old-style mechanical punch code. She didn't know the combination, but she didn't need to. She pulled a small electronic device from her kit, a contact microphone, and pressed it against the housing. She began to turn the tumblers. In her ears, the clicks were as loud as gunshots. She listened for the slack in the mechanism, the tiny change in the resonance when the pin hit the notch. 5209. The mechanism groaned. There was a hiss of escaping air, a pressurized seal being broken. The door began to slide open, the sound of metal on metal echoing through the trees. Elena froze, her hand on her weapon, scanning the woods. Nothing. The mountain was silent. She slipped inside, the door closing behind her with a heavy thud. The air inside the bunker was cold and smelled of ozone and ancient dust. The walls were bare concrete, lit by the flickering glow of emergency lights that shouldn't have been working. Elena moved down the main corridor, her NVGs picking up the faint heat signatures of the light fixtures. The deeper she went, the louder the hum became. It wasn't just power now. It was the sound of data, the frantic, staccato chatter of high-speed servers. She reached the central command room. It was a vast, circular chamber filled with rows of old consoles. But in the center of the room, someone had installed a modern server rack, a tower of blinking blue and green lights that looked like a jagged tooth in an old mouth. And sitting at the main desk, his back to her, was a man in a tattered flight suit. His head was bowed, his hands resting on a keyboard. He was thin, skeletal almost, and his hair was a shock of white. "Elias," Elena whispered. The man didn't move. "I knew you'd come, Elena. I told them you were the only one who could hear the song." The voice was the same as the one on the radio, but up close it was even more frayed. Elena stayed in the shadows, her weapon leveled at the center of his back. She didn't believe in ghosts, and she didn't believe in miracles. "Turn around," she said. Slowly. The man turned. It was Elias Thorne, or a nightmare version of him. Half of his face was a map of burned scars, his left eye clouded over with a milky film. His right arm was in a makeshift sling, and his flight suit was stained with old blood and grease. But his right eye, the one that still worked, was as sharp and blue as it had been the day they met at Mead. "You're supposed to be dead," Elena said, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. "I was," Elias said, a ghost of a smile touching his scarred lips. "They kept me in a box for 2 years, Elena, a black site in Poland. They wanted the vagabond keys. They wanted to know how you did it." "How I did what?" "How you heard the signal from the Gray 7, the one that didn't come from Earth." Elena felt the room tilt. The Gray 7 signal, the one she'd tracked in the valley, had been the reason she was pushed out. She'd always thought it was an enemy transmission. She'd never considered the alternative. "They reopened the gate, Elias said, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "Holloway and the others, they weren't trying to stop the signal. They were trying to call it back, and they succeeded. Something is coming through, and it's not a message. It's a signature. A viral code that's rewriting every encryption protocol in the U.S. network. In 6 hours, we'll be blind. Our satellites, our drones, our power grid, it'll all belong to them." "Who is them?" Elena asked. Elias shook his head. "I don't know, but they're not from Moscow and they're not from Beijing. Holloway thinks he can control it. He thinks he can use it to build a new world order. But he's a fool. He's just the one opening the door for the wolves." Before Elena could respond, her ear caught a new sound. It was faint, coming from the ventilation shafts, a rhythmic tapping. "They're here," she said. "The Suburbans?" Elias asked. "No," Elena said, her eyes narrowing. "They're already in the building. I hear the boots, 6-man team, high-end gear. They're moving in a pincer formation." She didn't ask how they got in. She didn't ask how they knew. She just moved. She grabbed Elias by the good arm and pulled him toward the back of the command room. "Can you move?" she asked. "I can crawl if I have to," Elias said. "You won't have to," Elena said. She looked at the server rack. "Can you shut it down?" "I can't kill the signal," Elias said. "It's already in the wild, but I can jam the local node. I can buy us enough time to get the data to a secure uplink, but I need a clear frequency." "I'll give you a frequency," Elena said. She pulled her laptop from her pack and slammed it onto the desk. "Get the data. I'll handle the noise." She didn't wait for him to start. She stepped out into the corridor, her SIG in her hand. The tapping was louder now. They were close. She could hear their breathing through the vents, synchronized, controlled, professional killers. She closed her eyes for a second, letting the acoustics of the bunker fill her mind. She could hear the way the air moved around them, the way their gear rattled against their vests. She knew exactly where they were. 1 at the end of the hall, 2 in the side room, 3 coming up the stairs. She didn't feel fear. She felt a cold, sharp clarity. This was what she was built for. This was why she couldn't stay in the cabin. The silence of Montana was a lie. The noise of the battle was the only truth she had ever known. She stepped around the corner and fired. The first man went down before he could raise his rifle, a clean shot to the tee-box. Elena didn't stop to look. She moved like a shadow, staying low, using the echoes of the bunker to mask her own footsteps. She fired again, 2 rounds into the chest of the second man as he emerged from the side room. She was a blur of dark competence. She wasn't just shooting, she was orchestrating the space. She used the metal walls to bounce the sound of her movements, making it seem like she was in 3 places at once. The remaining men began to fire wildly, their suppressed rifles coughing in the dark. But they were hitting shadows. Elena reached the third man, the one on the stairs. She didn't shoot him. She was out of rounds in the first mag. She dropped the SIG and moved inside his guard, her hands finding the soft spots in his armor. She took him down with a brutal, efficient strike to the throat, followed by a knee to the temple. He collapsed without a sound. She stood over him, her chest heaving, the metallic smell of blood and gunpowder filling her nose. She checked her watch. 4 minutes had passed since she'd entered the command room. She heard a voice over the tactical radio on the dead man's vest. "Team leader status, we have a breach at the main door. Additional units are arriving. Holloway is on site. Repeat, the colonel is on site." Elena picked up the radio. She didn't speak. She just listened to the breathing on the other end. It was the same rhythm as the men she had just killed. She walked back to the command room. Elias was slumped over the keyboard, his face pale, but the progress bar on the screen was at 90%. "Almost. There," he gasped. "Holloway is here, Elias," Elena said. "He's at the door." Elias looked up at her, his scarred face twisted in a grimace of pain. "He won't let us leave, El. He can't if the world finds out what he's been doing." "The world isn't going to find out from a report," Elena said. She looked at the server rack, then back at her laptop. "They're going to hear it." She reached out and grabbed the headset from the desk. She plugged it into the PRC 150 she'd brought in the Pelican case. She didn't tune it to a secure channel. She tuned it to the emergency broadcast frequency, the one that every radio station, every police band, and every military post in the country was required to monitor. "What are you doing?" Elias asked. "I'm giving them the song," Elena said. She flipped the switch. The vagabond pulse began to broadcast, but this time it wasn't a secret. It was a roar. She layered the raw data from Elias's download over the carrier wave, creating a signal so powerful and so strange that it would be heard from Maine to California. "This is Chief Warrant Officer Elena Vance," she said into the mic, her voice calm and steady, the voice of a woman who had nothing left to lose. "I am broadcasting from Extraction Point 0. The gate is open. If you are hearing this, the code is in the air. Look to your screens. Look to your sky. The silence is over." Outside, the heavy thud of the blast door opening echoed through the bunker. The sound of heavy boots, dozens of them, flooded the corridor. Elena didn't look at the door. She looked at Elias. "You ready?" she asked. Elias reached out and took her hand. His grip was weak, but his eyes were clear. "I've been waiting 3 years for this, El." The command room door burst open. Colonel Holloway stepped in, surrounded by a dozen men in full tactical gear. He looked older, his hair thinner, but the arrogance in his eyes was unchanged. He looked at the server rack, then at Elena, then at the radio. "Turn it off, Vance," he said, his voice a low growl. "You have no idea what you're doing. You're playing with things you can't comprehend." "I comprehend the sound of a lie, Colonel," Elena said. She didn't move her hand from the radio. "And your song is out of tune." Holloway raised his weapon. "Last chance. Turn it off, or I'll bury you in this hole for real this time." Elena looked at him, and for the first time in 3 years, she smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a predator who had finally found the right frequency. "It's too late," she said. "The song is already at the chorus." As she spoke, the monitors in the room began to flicker. The blue and green lights on the server rack turned a violent, pulsing red. And then, from every speaker in the room, from the tactical radios on the soldiers' vests, and from the handheld units in their pockets, a sound began to emerge. It wasn't static. It wasn't a voice. It was a scream, a digital, high-frequency scream that ripped through the air, shattering the glass in the consoles and sending the soldiers to their knees, their hands over their ears. Elena didn't flinch. She stood in the center of the storm, the sound washing over her like a familiar tide. She could hear the architecture of it, the beautiful, terrible complexity of the signal from the Gray 7. It was beautiful, it was terrifying, and it was just beginning. Holloway collapsed, his nose bleeding, his eyes wide with a terror he couldn't name. He tried to speak, but the sound drowned him out. Elena leaned into the microphone one last time. "To anyone still listening," she said, her voice rising above the digital scream. "Don't try to stop it, just listen. The lyrics are about to change." She reached out and turned the dial to maximum gain. The bunker trembled as the signal reached its peak, a shockwave of sound that felt like the earth itself was cracking open. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No hum of power, no chatter of servers, no breathing of dying men. Elena stood in the dark, her hand still on the dial. She could feel the weight of the silence, the way it pressed against her eardrums. It was a new kind of silence, not the peace of the mountains, but the silence of a world that had been reset. She looked at Elias. He was gone, his head slumped forward, a peaceful expression on his scarred face. He had done his part. He had helped her open the door. She picked up her pack and walked toward the door. The soldiers were still on the floor, unconscious or dead, their bodies twisted in the wreckage of the command room. Holloway was slumped against a wall, his eyes open but vacant, his mind broken by the frequency he had tried to master. Elena walked past them without a word. She moved through the corridors, her boots clicking on the concrete, the sound echoing in the empty bunker. She reached the blast door and stepped out into the night. The air was cold and crisp. The stars were bright above the Bitterroots, a million tiny points of light in the vast, dark sky. Elena stood there for a moment, breathing in the scent of pine and snow. She heard a soft whine from the brush. Scout emerged from the shadows, his tail wagging tentatively. He looked at Elena, then at the bunker, then at the sky. "It's okay, Scout," she said, her voice a soft rasp. "The gate is open." She walked to the truck and climbed in. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't need to. She could hear it now, a faint, rhythmic pulse coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a new song, a different song. She started the engine and drove down the mountain, leaving the bunker and the ghosts behind. She didn't know what the world would look like when the sun came up. She didn't know if there would be an army to court-martial her or a government to hunt her down. But as she reached the highway and turned toward the north, toward the deep, silent woods where no one would ever find her, Elena Vance did something she hadn't done in a long, long time. She began to hum. The gas pump at the Sinclair station in Wisdom, Montana, stopped at exactly $14. 22, the digital numbers flickering for a heartbeat before they were replaced by a cascading waterfall of glowing green hex code that only Elena Vance knew how to read. It was 4:14 a.m. The air smelled of unleaded fuel, damp asphalt, and the sharp, metallic tang of an approaching electric storm. Elena didn't hang up the nozzle. She kept her hand wrapped around the cold plastic handle, her eyes fixed on the display. The code was cycling at 60 hertz, perfectly synced with the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. It wasn't a random glitch. It was a handshake. The vagabond signal she had unleashed at the bunker wasn't just broadcasting, it was colonizing the grid. Inside the station, a teenager in a faded Grizzlies hoodie was staring at a lottery terminal that was spitting out rolls of blank thermal paper. He didn't look scared yet, just annoyed, the way people are when the technology they trust starts acting like a stranger. He didn't see the way the shadows in the corner of the shop were vibrating. He didn't hear what Elena heard, the sound of the Earth's own magnetic field being plucked like a cello string. To Elena, the sound was a physical weight in her chest, a low-frequency thrum that made her molars ache. She finally hung up the pump and walked toward the Tacoma. Scout was sitting in the passenger seat, his body a rigid line of muscle, his head tilted at that specific 6-degree angle he used when he was tracking a scent through a crosswind. He wasn't looking at the station or the woods. He was looking up. Above the jagged silhouette of the Beaverhead Mountains, the stars weren't twinkling. They were pulsing in a rhythmic, 3-beat sequence. 1, 2, 3. The gate wasn't just open. The hinges had been torn off. Elena climbed into the cab and started the engine. The radio didn't produce static. It produced a clear, melodic tone, a perfect middle C that held for 5 seconds before dropping an octave. She didn't turn it off. She couldn't. The sound was coming from the speakers, the dashboard, and the very frame of the truck. She pulled out of the station and headed west toward the Idaho border. She had 300 miles of mountain roads ahead of her and a data load in her head that was currently rewriting the fundamental laws of American signal intelligence. She thought about Elias Thorne. She thought about the way his hand had felt, cold, papery, and desperate, when he'd gripped hers in that dying bunker. For 3 years, she had carried the guilt of his death like a stone in her pocket, only to find out that the stone was a seed. The Elias she had seen wasn't just a man. He was a bridge. Holloway and the others at Fort Huachuca had spent years trying to build a receiver for the Gray 7 signal, but they'd forgotten that the best receiver in the history of the world wasn't made of silicon and copper. It was made of bone and nerve. They had used Elias as a biological antenna, and in doing so, they had given the signal a way to translate itself into something the human world could understand. The problem was, the human world wasn't ready for the translation. She reached the top of a rise and saw the first signs of the systemic collapse. A convoy of semi-trucks was pulled over on the shoulder of Highway 43, their hazard lights flashing in a frantic, uncoordinated strobe. The drivers were standing on the asphalt, staring at their smartphones. Elena didn't need to see their screens to know what they were seeing. Every device with a processor was currently being invited to the same conversation. It was a dark protocol failure, the kind she had warned the JAG office about years ago. When you build a civilization on a foundation of interconnected signals, the person who controls the frequency controls the civilization. She felt a sharp, sudden pain in her left ear, followed by the warm trickle of blood. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, her expression never changing. This was the cost of the ear. The sensitivity that had made her a legend in the windowless rooms of Mead was now a liability. She was hearing too much. She could hear the GPS satellites screaming as their orbits were nudged by phantom data. She could hear the cooling fans of the server farms in Utah spinning up to the point of structural failure. She could hear the collective heartbeat of a nation that was slowly realizing the lights weren't just going out, they were being reclaimed. "Easy, Scout," she murmured, more for herself than the dog. Scout let out a low, mournful howl, a sound that harmonized perfectly with the tone coming from the radio. Elena realized then that the dog wasn't just reacting to the noise. He was part of the architecture. The military had spent millions of dollars on Scout's training, enhancing his sensory nodes to detect the minute electrical signatures of wides. They had inadvertently created a living SIGINT sensor. The relationship between a handler and a K9 was usually described as a bond of loyalty, but between Elena and Scout, it was something more clinical and more profound. They were two broken instruments tuned to the same impossible frequency. They had both been discarded by an institution that found their capabilities inconvenient. Now that same institution was likely burning to the ground because it couldn't hear the warning they had both been shouting for years. She passed a sign for Sula, Montana, and saw a blacked-out Humvee idling in the middle of the road. Two men in multi-cam fatigues were standing beside it, holding M4s at a low-ready. They didn't have any unit patches on their shoulders. No name tapes, just the black and gray American flag. These weren't National Guard. These were the eraser teams, the private contractors and black-budget units that Holloway kept on a short leash. Elena didn't slow down. She shifted the Tacoma into fifth and gripped the wheel, her eyes narrowing. She could hear the hum of their tactical comms. They were using a localized mesh network trying to stay beneath the vagabond interference. Target vehicle sighted. Silver Tacoma, Montana plates, requesting authorization to neutralize. The voice in her ear was crisp, professional, and entirely devoid of hesitation. It was the sound of the system attempting to fix its mistake. Elena waited until she was 50 yards from the Humvee. She didn't reach for her SIG. She reached for the dial on her tactical SIGINT box. She didn't turn it up. She tuned it to the specific resonant frequency of the Humvee's electronic fuel injection system. It was a trick she'd learned in a dusty garage in Kandahar while trying to stop a suicide truck without firing a shot. She pulsed the signal. The Humvee's engine didn't just die, it buckled. The hood of the vehicle groaned as the electronic components inside underwent a massive, localized thermal expansion. The two soldiers dived for cover as the engine block cracked with a sound like a thunderclap. Elena swept past them, the Tacoma's tires kicking up a spray of gravel. She saw one of the soldiers raise his rifle in the rearview mirror, but he didn't fire. He was too busy staring at his optic, which was currently glowing with the same green hex code she'd seen at the gas station. She was 10 miles past Sula when the first real realization hit her. The failure wasn't just technical, it was institutional. Back in Virginia, in the sprawling complex of the National Counterterrorism Center, there would be a room full of people, directors, analysts, undersecretaries, who were currently looking at a red screen event. They would be following a protocol written in 1998, a series of boxes to check, a chain of command to follow. They would be calling for briefings, requesting satellite imagery that didn't exist, and waiting for orders from a White House that was likely currently being evacuated. The system was designed to handle a threat it could name. It was designed for a Russian cyber attack, a Chinese EMP, or a domestic insurgency. It was not designed for a signal that moved like a virus and sounded like a choir. The institutional failure wasn't that they couldn't stop the signal. It was that they couldn't conceive of a reality where they weren't the ones in control of the airwaves. Elena knew exactly what would happen next. They wouldn't try to understand the Gray 7 signal. They would try to sanitize the source. And to them, Elena Vance was the source. She pulled off the highway and onto a narrow, overgrown logging trail that led up toward the Sapphire Range. She needed a high-altitude vantage point. She needed to see the shape of the interference. She reached a clearing near the summit as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, a bruised purple light that didn't do anything to warm the air. She stepped out of the truck, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face. She grabbed the Pelican case and set it on the tailgate. "Scout, watch," she said. The dog leaped out and took up a position on a granite outcropping, his nose to the wind. Elena opened the case and began to assemble the collapsible Yagi antenna. Her hands were steady, despite the cold and the fact that she hadn't slept in 24 hours. She was in the zone now, that state of dark competence where the world narrowed down to the task at hand. She wasn't a retired warrant officer in Montana. She was a weapons system. She connected the antenna to the laptop and ran a wide-spectrum scan. The waterfall display on the screen was a nightmare. Usually, a radio spectrum looks like a series of distinct peaks and valleys. Cell signals here, aviation bands there, background cosmic noise at the bottom. But this looked like a solid wall of light. The Gray 7 signal had unified the entire spectrum. It was a monolithic, coherent wave that was vibrating at the same frequency as the Earth's ionosphere. "My God," she whispered. She wasn't looking at a jammer. She was looking at a planetary-scale antenna. The gate wasn't a door that something was coming asterisk through asterisk. The gate was the Earth itself. Whatever Elias had triggered, it had turned the entire atmosphere into a resonant chamber. She heard a sound then, a sound that didn't come through her headset. It was a low, rhythmic thumping. Helicopters. She didn't need the ear to know what they were. The AH-64 Apache has a very specific acoustic signature, a twin-engine growl combined with the slap of the four-bladed main rotor. There were two of them coming up from the valley, flying nap of the Earth to avoid radar. Not that radar was working, but old habits die hard for Army pilots. They were coming for her. Elena didn't run for the truck. She didn't reach for her pistol. Instead, she sat down at the laptop, her fingers flying across the keys. She had 5 minutes before they topped the ridge, maybe less. "What did you see, Elias?" she muttered, her eyes scanning the raw data packets. "What did you give me?" She found it buried in the subcarrier of the Vagabond Hop, a hidden directory encrypted with a key that wasn't a number but a frequency. It was the same middle C that had come through her truck radio. She hummed the note, a clear, resonant tone that felt like it was vibrating in her very marrow, and the directory opened. Inside was a single file, *Orpheus Final Report, PDF*. She opened it. The first page was a black and white photo of a satellite dish in the middle of a desert, its surface glowing with a strange, bioluminescent blue. The text beneath it was redacted in heavy black bars, but she could make out the words, *. Not a transmission, a reflection. We are seeing ourselves from the other side. The other side. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana wind. She looked at the signal on her screen again. It wasn't a message from the stars. It was an echo. The Gray 7 signal was a bounce, a signal sent from Earth decades ago that had hit something out there and was now returning, changed. It was like shouting into a canyon and hearing a voice that wasn't yours shout back. The Apaches topped the ridge. The roar of the rotors was deafening, the downwash kicking up a cloud of pine needles and dust. The lead helicopter hovered 50 yards away, its M230 chain gun swiveling to track her. The pilot didn't say anything over a loudspeaker. There were no warnings. Elena didn't look at the helicopters. She looked at the laptop. She had one chance to prove she was more than a target. She tapped into the Apache's tactical data link, the Link 16. It was supposed to be the most secure communication system in the world, an unbreakable encryption that kept the U.S. military's eyes and ears synchronized. But Link 16 was built on the same physics as everything else, and Elena Vance knew the lyrics to the physics. She didn't crash their systems. She didn't turn them into bricks. Instead, she fed them the echo. She took the Gray 7 signal and folded it back into their targeting computers. On the pilot's head-up display, HUD, Elena Vance disappeared. She wasn't replaced by a blank space. She was replaced by a mirror. The pilot wasn't looking at a retired warrant officer on a ridge. He was looking at himself. The helicopter's sensors, confused by the recursive data loop, began to report that the target was actually the helicopter itself. The chain gun drifted. The pilot pulled back, the Apache bucking in the air as the flight control computer struggled to process the paradoxical input. "Lead, this is 2. What are you doing? You're painting me. Break away." "I'm not painting you 2. My HUD is melting. I've got a critical system failure." Elena watched them dance. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight, two of the most sophisticated killing machines ever built, rendered helpless by a single string of code. They weren't being attacked by an enemy. They were being overwhelmed by their own complexity. This was the institutional failure in its purest form. The more complex the system, the more vulnerable it was to the truth. And the truth was that the signal didn't care about their ranks, their missions, or their fire control protocols. The Apaches broke formation and retreated, their pilots likely terrified by the ghosts in their machines. They would go back to base, file a report that nobody would believe, and wait for a command that would never come. Elena sat back against the tailgate of the Tacoma, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She looked at Scout. The dog was still standing on the rock, but he had relaxed his posture. He looked at her, his amber eyes filled with a quiet, ancient intelligence. "We can't stay here, Scout," she said. She knew where she had to go. There was only one place in the country with the processing power and the clean air to actually talk to the Echo. It wasn't Meade. It wasn't Huachuca. It was the Vault, a deep underground signals facility in the high desert of Utah, built into the side of a mountain and shielded by 300 feet of solid granite. It was the only place that could survive the atmospheric resonance. It was also the place where Holloway would be heading. She packed the gear back into the Pelican case with the same methodical precision she'd used to gut the trout. Every movement was a deliberate act of will. She was tired, the kind of tired that lives in the bones, but she couldn't stop. The mission wasn't over, it had just changed. She climbed into the truck and started the engine. She didn't head back to the highway. She headed south through the backcountry, following the ghost roads and the dry creek beds. She was a shadow moving through a world that was slowly losing its grip on reality. As she drove, she found herself thinking about her father. She thought about the porch in Iowa and the sound of the freight trains. Asterisk, everything has a song, Elle. You just have to learn the lyrics. Asterisk, she realized now that her father hadn't been talking about trains. He'd been talking about the universe. He'd been talking about the fact that nothing is ever truly silent. There is always a vibration, always a pulse, always a story being told in the spaces between the noise. The Gray 7 signal was that story, and she was the only one left who could tell it. She reached the border of Idaho as the sun reached its zenith. The world looked normal. The pines were green, the sky was blue, the mountains were eternal. But she could see the shimmer in the air, the way the light bent around the invisible structures of the signal. It was like looking at the world through a sheet of distorted glass. She pulled over near a small stream to let Scout drink and to splash some cold water on her face. The water was icy, stinging her skin and clearing the cobwebs from her mind. She looked at her reflection in the pool. She looked older. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there a week ago and a streak of silver in her dark hair that looked like a scar. She didn't mind. The person she had been, the quiet woman who sold huckleberry jam and lived in a 4-room cabin, was gone. That woman had been a mask. This woman, the one with the blood on her ear and the data in her head, was the truth. She heard a sound then, a soft, metallic click. She didn't move, she didn't reach for her gun, she just stood there, the water dripping from her chin. "You always did have a habit of finding the most scenic spots to hide, Vance." The voice came from behind a stand of willow trees. It was a woman's voice, low, gravelly, and familiar. Elena turned slowly. Standing 10 feet away was a woman in a dusty flight suit, a cigarette dangling from the corner of her mouth. She was holding an old-fashioned map case in one hand and a radio in the other. Her hair was a messy bun of gray and blonde, and her eyes were the color of a winter lake. Major Sarah Sullivan. Sully had been Elena's spotter back in the days when they were both tracking ghosts in the Balkans. She was the only person Elena had ever trusted with the ear. Sully didn't have the gift, but she had something better. She knew how to listen to the person who did. "Sully," Elena said, her voice a dry whisper. "I heard your broadcast, Elle," Sully said, taking a long drag on the cigarette. "The whole damn country heard it, though I suspect most of them think it was a very aggressive car commercial." "How did you find me?" Sully tapped the radio in her hand. "I didn't, he did." She gestured toward the trees. A man stepped out, his hands held in front of him. It was Miller. He looked exhausted, his ranger-tabbed jacket torn and stained with grease. "Laney," Miller said, his voice thick with emotion. "I tried to call the sheriff. I tried to do what you said, but the phones started talking back to me." "It's everywhere, Miller," Elena said. "We know," Sully said, stepping forward. "We've been tracking the vagabond bounce from a mobile rig in Missoula. We figured you'd be heading for the vault. It's the only place left with a hardened uplink." "You shouldn't be here, Sully," Elena said. This isn't your fight. Sully laughed, a dry, hacking sound. Elle, look around, the world is glitching. My car won't start, my TV is playing Russian opera, and I'm pretty sure the microwave in my kitchen just tried to achieve sentience. This is everyone's fight now. She walked over to the Tacoma and patted the hood. You still driving this piece of junk? I told you to get a Tundra. It gets me where I need to go, Elena said. The three of them stood there in the quiet of the Idaho woods, a retired warrant officer, a washed-up major, and a broken ranger. They were the leftovers of a system that had failed them, the ones who had been pushed out because they saw the cracks in the foundation. Now they were the only ones standing between the foundation and the collapse. Holloway is already at the vault, Sully said, her expression turning serious. He took a C-130 out of Malmstrom before the grid went dark. He's got a full battalion of security associates with him. They're digging in, Elle. They think they can use the vault's processors to cleanse the signal and keep it for themselves. They can't, Elena said. The signal isn't a tool, it's an echo. If they try to compress it, it'll shatter the facility. Then we better get there before they turn the state of Utah into a crater, Sully said. She reached into her map case and pulled out a worn, laminated sheet. It was a topographical map of the Dugway Proving Ground, the most secretive military installation in the United States. I've got a back door, Sully said. An old ventilation shaft from the 60s that doesn't appear on the modern schematics. It's tight, it's dirty, and it's probably full of rattlesnakes, but it'll get us inside the perimeter. Elena looked at Sully, then at Miller, then at Scout. She felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't hope. Hope was too fragile for a world like this. It was loyalty. The specific, hard-earned loyalty of people who had been through the fire together and knew exactly what it cost to stay alive. Let's go, Elena said. They moved out in a two-vehicle convoy, Sully's battered Jeep leading the way. They stayed off the main roads, cutting through the high-desert scrub and the volcanic rock of the Snake River Plain. The world around them was descending into a quiet, eerie chaos. They passed towns where the streetlights were flickering in Morse code, and farms where the automated irrigation systems were creating complex, fractal patterns in the dirt. The vagabond signal was growing stronger. To Elena, the sound was now a constant, shimmering presence at the edge of her consciousness. It wasn't just a tone anymore. It was becoming a voice. Not a human voice, but a collective one, a vast, echoing chorus of every signal ever sent, every word ever spoken into the void, all of it returning at once. She could hear the history of the world in the vibration. She could hear the first radio broadcasts of the 1920s, the frantic Morse code of sinking ships, the quiet whispers of lovers over long-distance lines. All of it was there, caught in the atmospheric resonance, being reflected back to Earth by the other side. The institutional failure wasn't just a lack of foresight. It was a lack of humility. The people in charge had thought they were the masters of the airwaves. They had thought they could fill the sky with their data and their secrets and their wars, and that the sky would just soak it up. They hadn't realized that the sky has a memory, and the memory was coming home. They reached the perimeter of the Dugway Proving Ground as the sun began to set on the second day. The desert was a vast, empty expanse of salt flats and sagebrush, dominated by the looming mass of the Stansbury Mountains. Somewhere inside those mountains was the vault. Sully pulled the Jeep over behind a low ridge. This is as far as we go on wheels. The shaft is 2 miles out near the base of the north face. They unloaded their gear in the gathering dark. Elena checked her SIG, the weight of the weapon familiar and grounding. She looked at Miller, who was checking his own rifle with a grim, practiced efficiency. Miller, you stay with the vehicles, Elena said. If we're not back by dawn, you take Sully's Jeep and you head south. Get as far away from the mountains as you can. Miller looked like he wanted to argue, but he saw the look in Elena's eyes and nodded. I'll be here, Laney. Don't make me wait too long. Elena and Sully, with Scout at their heels, began the long trek across the salt flats. The ground was crunchy under their boots, the white salt glowing like snow in the moonlight. The air was perfectly still, but the ear was screaming. The resonance was so strong here that Elena could see the air vibrating, the very molecules of oxygen and nitrogen dancing in time with the 3-beat pulse. They reached the ventilation shaft an hour later. It was a rusted, circular opening in the rock, partially hidden by a screen of dead brush. It looked like an abandoned mine, but Elena could hear the hum of the massive intake fans deep inside. You ready for this, Elle? Sully asked, checking her flashlight. No, Elena said, but I'm the only one who knows the lyrics. They climbed into the shaft, the air inside smelling of damp earth and stale grease. It was a tight fit, the metal walls pressing against their shoulders as they crawled deeper into the mountain. Scout moved ahead of them, his claws clicking on the metal, his breathing the only sound in the darkness. After what felt like miles of crawling, the shaft opened up into a large, rectangular room filled with massive, humming machinery. "We're in," Sully whispered, her lights scanning the room. "This is the primary cooling deck for the main processors." Elena stood up, stretching her cramped muscles. She could feel the vibration of the vault now. It was like standing inside a giant, beating heart. The sound was overwhelming, a roar of pure data that made her head spin. "They are close," she said, her hand going to her SIG. She could hear the boots on the metal walkways above them. She could hear the clipped professional voices of the security contractors. And beneath it all, she could hear Holloway. He was in the main control room, 3 floors up. He was shouting at a technician, his voice tight with a desperate, frantic energy. "I don't care about the thermal limits. Push the processors to 100%. We need to isolate the vagabond hop. If we don't get control of the carrier wave in the next hour, the entire U.S. Northcom network is going to desync. Sir, the system is already at critical. If we push it any further, we'll have a core-level meltdown." "Do it. That's an order." Elena looked at Sully. "He's going to kill us all." "Not if we kill him first," Sully said, her eyes hard. They moved toward the stairs, staying in the shadows, using the noise of the cooling fans to mask their movements. They were a 2-woman strike team, moving with the same synchronized grace they'd had 20 years ago. Elena provided the ear, sensing the positions of the guards through the vibrations of their gear, while Sully provided the tactical direction. They reached the 2nd floor without being spotted. Elena could see the main server hall through a thick glass window. It was a forest of black towers, lit by a sea of blinking red lights. The heat in the room was intense, the air shimmering with the effort of the processors. "There," Elena whispered, pointing toward a small, reinforced door at the end of the hall. "The secondary uplink. If I can get in there, I can bypass Holloway's terminal and talk directly to the signal." "I'll draw them off," Sully said. "Give me 3 minutes, then go." "Sully, don't get sentimental on me, El. It's bad for the mission." Sully winked, then slipped away into the darkness. Elena waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at Scout, who was huddled beside her. "Stay, Scout, stay." The dog looked at her, his amber eyes reflecting the red glow of the server hall. He didn't whine. He just watched her, his loyalty absolute. A sudden explosion rocked the facility. The sound of an alarm blared, a high-pitched shriek that cut through the roar of the fans. Elena heard the shouts of the guards, the clatter of boots on the metal stairs. "Breach on level 2, all units to the cooling deck. We have an intruder." Elena didn't wait. She burst through the door and ran across the server hall, the heat making her skin sting. She reached the secondary uplink door and punched in the override code she'd memorized from Elias's report. The door slid open. She stepped inside and slammed the door shut, the sound of gunfire echoing in the hall behind her. She was in a small, windowless room dominated by a single glowing terminal. She sat down and began to type. She didn't try to stop the signal. She didn't try to save the network. She knew it was too late for that. The institutional failure was complete. The old world was already gone. Instead, she did what she had done at the bunker. She opened the gate wider. She took the echo, the returning memory of the world, and she gave it a voice. She used the vault's massive processing power to amplify the Gray 7 signal, turning it from a roar into a message. On the screen in front of her, the hex code began to resolve into images. She saw the Iowa porch. She saw the Chugach Mountains. She saw the faces of the people she'd lost. Elias, her father, the men of the 3rd platoon. They weren't just memories anymore. They were part of the signal. They were the lyrics. The door to the uplink room burst open. Elena didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She could hear the sound of Holloway's breathing. It was shallow, ragged, and terrified. "Step away from the terminal, Vance," he said, his voice trembling. Elena finished the last line of code and hit **enter**. She turned slowly. Holloway was standing in the doorway, his uniform disheveled, his eyes wild. He was holding a pistol, but his hand was shaking so badly he could barely aim it. "You've destroyed everything," he whispered. "The network, the command structure, the security of this country. It's all gone." "It was already gone, Colonel," Elena said, her voice calm and steady. "You just didn't have the ears to hear it." Holloway looked at the terminal where the images were still cycling, a kaleidoscope of human history reflecting back from the stars. "What is it?" he asked, his voice a tiny, broken sound. "It's us," Elena said. It's everything we ever said into the dark coming back to ask us if we meant it. The facility began to shake. The roar of the processors reached a crescendo, a sound so loud it was no longer a sound but a physical force. The lights in the room began to brighten, turning from red to a blinding, pure white. Holloway dropped his gun and fell to his knees, his hands over his ears. Elena stood up, the light washing over her. She could feel the vibration in her very soul, a perfect, resonant harmony that felt like coming home. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't angry. She was just listening. In the final second before the vault's processors reached their limit, before the energy of the signal overwhelmed the physical structure of the mountain, Elena Vance heard one last thing. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a tone. It was a single word spoken in a voice that sounded like a million people speaking at once. Wait. And then the world went white. When the primary breaker room on level 4 of the vault detonated at 0422, the sound didn't reach Elena Vance's ears through the air, but through the ceramic fillings in her molars. The whiteout wasn't an absence of vision. It was a sensory tidal wave that scrubbed the world clean of shadows, leaving her pinned to the cold, vibrating floor of the uplink room while her equilibrium shattered. She didn't scream because there was no room for sound in a throat filled with the metallic taste of ionized ozone. For 3 seconds, she wasn't a woman or a soldier. She was a copper wire being forced to carry the voltage of a lightning strike. The light receded slowly, peeling back from the edges of her vision like burning paper. The smell hit first, the cloying, sweet stench of scorched server insulation and the sharp vinegar tang of spilled battery acid. Elena rolled onto her stomach, her fingers clawing at the industrial carpet. Her left ear was a cavern of ringing silence, but her right, the ear, was alive with a terrifying, high-velocity chattering. It wasn't the signal anymore. It was the building itself. She could hear the structural steel of the mountain facility groaning as it underwent rapid thermal expansion, the microscopic pops of rivets shearing off under the pressure of a resonance that shouldn't exist in a physical world. "Scout!" she rasped. The word felt like it was made of gravel. A heavy, warm weight pressed against her side. Scout was there, his fur matted with dust, his body vibrating with a low-frequency tremor that mirrored the floor. He didn't bark. He was in his own version of hell, his heightened canine senses bombarded by the same electromagnetic storm that was currently liquefying the facility's hard drives. Elena reached out, her hand shaking, and buried her fingers in the scruff of his neck. They were both still alive. That was the only mission objective that mattered for the next 10 seconds. She looked toward the door. Holloway was gone. The space where he had been kneeling was empty, save for his discarded Sig Sauer P-226 and a smear of blood on the doorframe where the concussive force of the whiteout had likely thrown him. The hallway beyond was a corridor of flickering emergency strobes and thick, rolling black smoke. Elena pushed herself up, her knees buckling once before locking into place. She didn't check the terminal. She didn't need to. She could hear the data flow. It sounded like a waterfall of broken glass, a jagged, relentless stream of information that was no longer being processed by the vault's computers, but was instead flowing through the very wiring of the walls. She was acting now without authorization, without a plan, and without the safety net of the institution she had served for 15 years. She had just initiated a full-spectrum grounding protocol, a theoretical emergency measure she'd once argued for in a windowless room at Fort Meade. A move that would effectively turn the Dugway mountain range into a massive lightning rod for the Gray 7 signal. It was a suicide play for the facility, designed to save the national grid by sacrificing the antenna. She grabbed Holloway's discarded pistol, checked the chamber with a practiced, mechanical flick of her wrist, and holstered it. She needed to find Sully. She needed to get out of the hot zone of the primary array before the resonance reached the cavitation point and started shaking the granite into sand. "Scout, heel," she commanded. They moved into the hallway. The air was thick enough to chew, a soup of fire-suppressant gas and pulverized drywall. Elena's ear acted as a sonar, guiding her through the gloom. She could hear the guards, the security associates, before she saw them. They were 50 feet ahead, their boots clattering on the metal grating of the catwalk. They weren't moving like a tactical unit anymore. They were moving like prey. Their heartbeats were erratic, thumping against the resonance like trapped birds. "Stay low," Elena whispered. She bypassed the main elevator bank. Those would be death traps now, the electromagnetic interference likely melting the magnetic brakes. She headed for the service stairs, the ones Sully had marked on the map. The vibration in the floor was becoming rhythmic now. 1, 2, 3. The pulse of the other side was asserting its dominance over the physical space. Every 3 seconds, the world blurred. Every 3 seconds, Elena felt a phantom pressure in her chest, as if a giant hand were trying to squeeze her heart. She reached the stairwell door and felt the heat radiating through the steel. Something was burning below them. She pulled the door open, her suppressed SIG at the low ready. A shadow moved in the smoke. "Vance, don't shoot, it's me." Sully stumbled through the doorway, her flight suit torn at the shoulder, her face a mask of soot and sweat. She was dragging a heavy Pelican case, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gulps. "Where's Miller?" Elena asked, her voice tight. "Still at the perimeter. The radios are useless, El. The atmosphere is solid lead. I barely made it off the cooling deck before the pipes started bursting. Holloway's boys are losing their minds. They started firing at shadows 10 minutes ago." Sully leaned against the wall, her eyes searching Elena's. "You did it, didn't you? You opened the gate." "I grounded it," Elena said. "I'm using the mountain to soak up the reflection, but the processors are redlining. If we don't get to the secondary heat exchangers and vent the coolant, this whole peak is going to blow like a dirty bomb." "The heat exchangers are on level 6, Sully said, checking the charge on her own sidearm. "That's 3 floors down, straight through the security barracks. Holloway's lead contractor, a guy named Voss, is down there. He's a true believer, El. He thinks he can still salvage the data." "He can't salvage what doesn't belong to him," Elena said. They began the descent. The stairwell was a vertical chimney of heat. Elena could hear the water lines screaming in the walls, the pressure building to the point of catastrophic failure. She led the way, Scout pressed against her leg, his ears flat against his head. Her capability, the thing they had called a neural anomaly in her medical discharge, was now the only thing keeping them from walking into an ambush. She could hear the electrical hum of the guards' night vision goggles, the faint whine of their tactical headsets trying to find a signal in the noise. They reached the level 6 landing. Elena held up a hand. *3 of them, she signaled to Sully with 2 fingers and a thumb, heavily armed, holding the corridor. Sully nodded, her expression hardening into the combat Sully Elena remembered from the mountains of Tora Bora. There was no room for fear, only the geometry of the engagement. Elena didn't use a flashbang, she didn't need one. She waited for the 3-beat pulse of the signal. *1, 2. On *3 the lights in the corridor surged with a blinding, violet intensity. The resonance hit its peak, a physical hammer of sound that made the guards' optics flare. Elena swung around the doorframe. She didn't fire for center mass. She fired for the environmental pipes above their heads, 3 shots spaced a half-second apart. The suppressed 9mm rounds punctured the pressurized steam lines. A wall of white, scalding vapor erupted into the hallway, screaming with a frequency that shredded the guards' ability to hear anything else. The men scrambled, blinded and deafened. Elena and Sully moved through the steam like ghosts. Elena didn't want to kill them. They were just men on a paycheck, victims of Holloway's ambition, but she wouldn't let them stop her. She used the butt of her pistol to drop the first man as he stumbled past. Sully took the second with a knee to the solar plexus and a sharp, controlled strike to the temple. The third man managed to level his carbine, but Scout was on him before he could find the trigger. The dog didn't go for the throat. He went for the lead leg, 100 pounds of muscle and teeth taking the man to the floor in a flurry of gray fur and tactical nylon. "Down, Scout," Elena commanded. The guard was sobbing, his leg mangled, his rifle sliding across the wet floor. Elena kicked it away. "Get to the surface," she told him, her voice cold and devoid of pity. "The mountain is coming down. Tell anyone you see to run." They pushed past him deeper into the bowels of the facility. The air was getting colder now, a strange, unnatural chill that came from the signal itself. Where the resonance was strongest, it seemed to suck the kinetic energy out of the air. Frost was forming on the edges of the server racks, even as the metal beneath them glowed a dull, cherry red. They reached the heat exchanger hub, a massive, circular room dominated by 4 towering turbines and a series of glowing blue conduits. In the center of the room, standing at a control console that was melting before his eyes, was Voss. He was a big man built like a linebacker, his face scarred by a dozen forgotten skirmishes. He was frantically typing into a keyboard that was sparking, his eyes fixed on a monitor that was displaying nothing but the green hex code. "Voss, step away!" Sully shouted, her weapon leveled at his head. Voss didn't look up. "The colonel said we could capture it. He said we could own the frequency. Do you have any idea what this is worth?" The The power to see the reflection before it even hits. We'd be gods. You're not gods, Elena said, stepping into the blue light of the conduits. You're just a man with a broken radio. Look at the monitors, Voss. That's not data. That's a eulogy. Voss finally looked at her, and Elena saw the madness in his eyes. It was the same madness she'd seen in the analysts at Mead, the desire to categorize the infinite, to put a leash on the universe. I can't let you shut it down, Voss whispered. He didn't go for his gun. He went for the manual override lever, a heavy iron bar that would bypass the safety vents and force the resonance back into the core, a move that would cause an immediate localized fusion event. He thought he was saving the data. He was actually priming a bomb. Elena acted before the thought was even fully formed. She didn't fire her pistol. She used the ear. She focused every ounce of her concentration on the high-tension cable running directly above Voss's head. She could hear its resonant frequency, the specific note of the copper wire under extreme electromagnetic stress. She began to hum. It was the middle C, the tone from the Idaho radio, but she pushed it, sharpened it, channeled the raw energy of the signal through her own vocal cords. The cable didn't snap. It sang. The vibration became so intense that the heavy-gauge wire began to oscillate, a whip of glowing orange metal. Voss looked up, his mouth opening in a silent O of terror as the cable underwent a structural failure. It lashed down, the sheer electrical potential of the line arcing through the air. The explosion threw Elena backward. She hit the floor hard, the air driven from her lungs. She watched through a haze of pain as Voss was consumed by a pillar of blue fire. He didn't even have time to scream. The manual override lever melted into a puddle of slag. Sully was at her side a second later, pulling her up. Elle, look at me. Elena's vision was swimming. Her right ear was bleeding now, a warm trickle that felt like a betrayal. The cost was being paid in full. Every time she used the capability, she was burning out a piece of herself. The vents, Elena gasped, pointing toward the manual release wheels on the far wall. Sully, the wheels, turn them now. Sully ran for the wheels, her boots slipping on the frosted floor. She grabbed the first iron valve and threw her weight into it. It didn't budge. The heat had expanded the threads, locking them in place. It's stuck, I can't move it. Elena looked at the conduits. The blue glow was turning white. The 3-beat pulse was accelerating. Asterisk 123, 123. Asterisk the mountain was preparing to exhale. She stood up, her body screaming in protest. She walked towards Sully, her steps deliberate and heavy. She reached the valve and placed her hands next to Sully's. Together, Elena said. She didn't rely on her muscles. She listened to the valve. She waited for the exact microsecond between the pulses, the moment when the resonance shifted from compression to expansion. Now! The iron wheel groaned, a sound like a dying whale, and then it turned. Then the second. Then the third. With a roar that sounded like a jet engine, the high-pressure coolant was vented into the mountain's subterranean shafts. The white light in the conduits faded back to a dull, throbbing blue. The vibration in the floor settled into a low, manageable hum. The immediate crisis had passed. The vault wouldn't explode, but the cost was written on Elena's face. She looked 20 years older, her eyes sunken, her skin the color of ash. She slumped against the valve, her chest heaving. We have to go, Sully said, her voice trembling. The security teams will be regrouping, and Holloway. Holloway isn't the type to just walk away. They began the long climb back toward the surface. The facility was a graveyard of technology. Everywhere they looked, the infrastructure of the American Signals Intelligence apparatus was shattered. Fiber optic cables hung from the ceiling like weeping willow branches. Terminals were melted into the desks. It was a billion-dollar tomb for a dead ideology. They reached the Level 3 staging area, a large open room that served as the main entrance to the underground complex. The heavy blast doors were partially open, a sliver of gray morning light cutting through the smoke. Almost there, Sully whispered, but Elena stopped. She could hear it, not a guard, not a machine. She could hear the sound of a single, rhythmic tapping, a finger against a metal desk. In the center of the staging area, sitting in a lone tactical chair, was Holloway. He was alone. His uniform was shredded, his face covered in a fine layer of white dust, but he looked strangely at peace. He was holding a small, handheld transmitter in his lap. You have a very particular set of skills, Elena, he said, his voice echoing in the empty room. I always knew you were the best. That's why I couldn't let you leave. You were the only one who could truly bridge the gap. The gap is closed, Colonel, Elena said, her weapon pointed at his chest. I grounded the signal. The mountain took it. Holloway smiled, a thin, ghost-like expression. The mountain took this part of it, but did you really think the other side was just one frequency? Did you think the echo was a single voice? He raised the transmitter. I've been in contact with the Pentagon, Elena, or what's left of it. They're terrified, and when the American government is terrified, it reverts to its most basic instinct, containment. What did you do? Elena asked, her heart sinking. I gave them your coordinates, all of them. The vagabond's signature is currently being broadcast from every tower between here and Missoula. I told them you were the source of the virus. I told them that as long as you were alive, the grid would never be safe. Elena looked at the blast doors. In the distance, she could hear the sound of approaching engines, not helicopters this time, jets, high-altitude bombers. They're going to sanitize the range, Sully said, her voice filled with a cold, dawning horror. They're going to level the entire proving ground. It's the only way to be sure, Holloway said, his eyes bright with a feverish light. A clean slate. We'll rebuild without the anomalies, without the ghosts. Elena felt a surge of rage, but it was a quiet, controlled thing. It wasn't explosive, it was a cold, sharp blade. She looked at Holloway, this man who had spent his entire life building walls around the truth, and she felt a profound sense of pity. You still don't understand, she said. The signal isn't a virus, it's us. You're trying to bomb your own reflection. She turned to Sully. Get Scout, get to the truck. Miller is waiting. What about you? I have to stay, I have to hold the ground. Elena, no. Sully, listen to me. Elena's voice cracked the air like a whip. The bombers are using the Link 16 network. If I don't stay at the terminal and feed them the same recursion loop I used on the Apaches, they'll hit the surrounding towns. They'll hit Wisdom. They'll hit Sula. I have to pull their targeting onto the vault. I have to be the lightning rod. Sully looked at the blast doors, then back at Elena. The silence between them was filled with 20 years of shared history, of secrets kept and burdens carried. It was the specific love of two people who had proven themselves in a world that didn't want them. I'm not leaving you, Sully said. Yes, you are, because you have to tell the story. You have to make sure they don't rewrite what happened here. If we both die, Holloway's version is the only one that survives. Elena stepped forward and gripped Sully's hand. Go, now. Sully's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She knew Elena was right. She whistled for Scout, the dog looking between the two women with a confused, mournful whine. Go, Scout, Elena whispered, her hand lingering on the dog's head for one last second. Take care of her. Scout let out a low, heartbreaking howl, then turned and followed Sully through the blast doors. Elena was alone with Holloway. The sound of the jets was louder now, the high-pitched scream of F-35s on a terminal approach. Elena walked over to the main security console and sat down. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with a calm, surgical precision. She didn't look at Holloway. She didn't look at the doors. She looked at the code. She found the Link 16 frequency. She found the bombers' tactical IDs. She began to weave the echo into their systems. She made herself the center of their world. On their HUDs, she wasn't a woman in a mountain. She was a beacon, a blinding, undeniable signal that demanded their attention. Holloway watched her, his transmitter forgotten in his lap. You're choosing this? He asked, his voice barely audible over the roar of the jets. I'm choosing the mission, Elena said. She could hear the bomb bay doors opening 5 miles above her. She could hear the GPS guidance systems locking on. She could hear the wind whistling past the fins of the J-dams. She reached out and touched the screen. The hex code was beautiful now. It wasn't a jumble of numbers, it was a tapestry. She could see the faces again. Her father, Elias, the men of the 3rd platoon. They were waiting for her in the white light. The first bomb hit the north face of the mountain. The shockwave threw Holloway from his chair, but Elena held onto the console, her fingers locked onto the keys. The ceiling began to collapse, massive slabs of granite falling like rain. The air was filled with a roar that was louder than anything she had ever heard, the sound of the mountain being unmade. Elena Vance didn't close her eyes. She didn't pray. She didn't beg. She simply listened. She listened to the sound of the earth breaking. She listened to the sound of the signal reaching its final, perfect resonance. And in the very last millisecond, before the world vanished into a pillar of fire and salt, she heard the voice again. It wasn't a million people this time. It was her father. Well done, Elle, the voice whispered. You learned the lyrics. Then there was only the light. Asterisk the immediate aftermath. Asterisk 10 miles away on the edge of the salt flats, Sully and Miller stood by the Tacoma, their eyes shielded against the blinding flash that erupted from the Stansbury Mountains. The sound followed seconds later. a low, rolling thunder that shook the ground and sent a cloud of white dust billowing into the sky. The mountain didn't disappear, but its peak was gone, replaced by a jagged, smoking crater. Sully sat on the tailgate of the truck, her head in her hands. Scout sat at her feet, his nose pressed against her knee, his body finally still. The ear was gone. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing Sully had ever felt. Miller walked over, his face pale. "Is it over?" "It's over," Sully said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive, the one Elena had pressed into her hand in the final seconds. It contained the real report. The vagabond logs, the truth about the Gray 7 signal and the cost of the institutional failure. She looked up at the sky. The jets were gone, heading back to their bases to file reports about a successful sanitization mission. The world would wake up tomorrow to a story about a domestic terrorist attack on a government facility. They would hear about a rogue warrant officer and a tragic loss of life. But the lights were coming back on. In the distance, the streetlights of a small town flickered to life, no longer pulsing in Morse code. The grid was stable. The atmospheric resonance was fading, the energy having been grounded into the salt of the Utah desert. The system had been saved by the person it had tried to destroy. Sully looked at the thumb drive, then at the smoking mountain. "She was right," Sully whispered. "The signal didn't care about our ranks." She climbed into the driver's seat of the Tacoma and started the engine. The radio didn't produce static. It didn't produce a middle C. It produced the local news from Salt Lake City, a mundane, comforting drone about weather and traffic. "Where are we going?" Miller asked. "To tell the story," Sully said. She shifted the truck into gear and pulled away from the salt flats, the silver Tacoma a small, defiant speck moving through the vast, indifferent desert. Behind them, the dust settled on the ruins of the vault, and for the first time in years, the air was perfectly, beautifully silent. Elena Vance was gone, but her ear remained in the hands of the woman who knew how to listen. The reckoning was coming, not in the form of a bomb or a signal, but in the form of a truth that could no longer be redacted. As the truck disappeared into the horizon, a single wild coyote standing on a ridge near the proving ground let out a long, clear howl. It wasn't a reflection. It wasn't an echo. It was just a sound. And in a world that had almost forgotten the difference, it was the most important thing of all. The fluorescent light in room 402 of the Walter Reed Annex didn't just hum. It vibrated at exactly 60 hertz, a flat, monotonous G-natural that felt like a needle being dragged across the raw surface of Elena Vance's brain. It was a sterile, windowless box designed for people the government didn't know whether to bury or debrief, a place where the air smelled of industrial bleach and the ghosts of men who had seen things they couldn't unsee. Elena sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her back as straight as a plumb line, her hands resting flat on her thighs. She was wearing a standard-issue gray tracksuit that felt like sandpaper against the skin of her arms, which was still tender from the flash burns she'd sustained in the vault. Her right ear, the one that had spent 15 years translating the whispers of the ionosphere, was packed with surgical gauze and taped shut. The silence on that side was a physical weight, a heavy, dead thing that made her feel like she was constantly leaning into a storm that was no longer there. Across from her sat a man named Miller, not the Miller who had driven the Tacoma, but a man in a charcoal suit whose name was probably also a lie. He had been there for 6 hours, his voice a low, rhythmic drone that tried to find a crack in her armor. He didn't use threats. He used the language of bureaucracy, the soft, padded words of institutional stability and national security interests. On the table between them was a digital recorder, its tiny red light blinking with the same persistence as a heartbeat. "Let's go back to the moment of the strike, Warrant Officer," the man said. He adjusted his glasses, the plastic frames clicking against his nose. The air-to-ground ordinance was authorized because the facility was deemed compromised by a foreign cyber actor. That is the official record. You were inside that mountain against direct orders. You were obstructing a sanitization mission. Why? Elena didn't blink. She watched the way the man's pulse throbbed in his neck, a frantic, jagged rhythm that told her he was lying to himself as much as he was trying to lie to her. Even with one ear silenced, she could hear the truth of him. She could hear the way his lungs hesitated before he spoke the word *sanitization*. "I wasn't obstructing," Elena said. Her voice was a dry rasp, the sound of wind over shale. "I was grounding. If I hadn't stayed at that terminal, the J-dams wouldn't have hit the vault. They would have hit the secondary resonance targets in the valley. You would have had 3,000 civilian casualties in Wisdom, Montana, and a power grid failure that would have reached as far east as Chicago. I didn't obstruct the mission. I fulfilled the only mission that mattered. The report from Colonel Holloway's office suggests a different narrative. The man countered. He didn't look at her. He looked at a file folder filled with redacted lines and blacked-out names. It suggests you were the one who initiated the Gray 7 feedback loop, that you were the source of the anomaly. Holloway is dead, Elena said. It wasn't a question. She had heard the mountain collapse. She had heard the specific frequency of granite failing under the weight of a 10,000-pound kinetic strike. Colonel Holloway is officially listed as missing in action, presumed deceased during a terrorist breach of a secure facility. The man said, his voice as cold as the room. The narrative is already in motion, Elena. The army is a machine that prefers a clean gear over a broken one, and right now you are the tooth that doesn't fit. You saved the grid, we acknowledge that, but how you saved it, the methods you used, the things you claim to hear, that's a problem for the people who sign the checks. Elena felt a surge of that quiet, controlled rage, a cold fire that started in the marrow of her bones and moved outward. They were trying to turn her into a ghost. They were trying to take the most honest thing she had ever done. The moment she had stood in the path of a lightning bolt to save a world that didn't even know it was in danger, and turn it into a footnote in a classified damage assessment report. "You didn't bring me here to acknowledge anything," she said. "You brought me here to see if I'm still a functional asset or if you need to dispose of the hardware." The man in the suit sighed a long, weary sound. He reached out and turned off the recorder. The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of a man who was about to tell the truth because the lie had become too heavy to carry. "There's a board meeting tomorrow morning at the Pentagon," he whispered. "Room 3E80. It's a closed-door inquiry. General Sterling is presiding. He's been reading your medical files since you were at Fort Meade. He knows about the ear, Elena. He knows you didn't just learn the signal. He knows you became it, and he's terrified of what that means for the chain of command. If a single soldier can decide which orders to follow based on a voice only she can hear, the entire structure of the military collapses." "I followed the mission," Elena repeated. "The mission is whatever they say it is," the man replied. He stood up, smoothing his suit jacket. "Tomorrow you'll be asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement and a voluntary retirement form. In exchange, the domestic terrorist investigation goes away. You get your pension. You get a house in Virginia. You get to live the rest of your life in a world that works, even if you're the only one who knows why it almost didn't." He walked to the door, his hand on the heavy steel handle. He paused, looking back at her. "The alternative is a court-martial for treason and a permanent stay in a facility much less comfortable than this one. Think about the cost, Elena, not just to you, to Sully, to the dog. They are being watched. Every move they make is a line in a ledger. Don't make them pay for your pride." He left, the heavy door clicking shut with a sound that echoed like a gunshot in Elena's good ear. She remained on the bed, the hum of the lights pressing in on her. She thought about Sully. She thought about the weight of the Tacoma as it pulled away from the salt flats. She thought about the thumb drive. She wondered if Sully had been smart enough to stay in the shadows, or if she was already sitting in a room just like this one, being told that her friend was a monster. The personal cost wasn't the burns or the deafness. It wasn't the threat of prison. It was the realization that the institution she had loved, the one she had given her youth, her hearing, and her soul to, regarded her loyalty as a liability. They didn't want a hero. They wanted a component. 300 miles away, in a dimly lit office in the basement of the Pentagon, General Richard Sterling was looking at a series of high-resolution satellite images. They showed the Stansbury Mountains before and after the strike. The peak of the mountain didn't just look bombed. It looked cauterized. The granite had turned to glass in certain sections, a phenomenon that shouldn't have been possible with conventional J-dams. Sterling was a man who had spent 40 years in the shadows of the Cold War and its messy aftermath. He was a creature of the establishment, a man who believed in the necessity of secrets. He had a glass of neat bourbon on his desk, the ice long since melted, and a leather-bound file that bore the name *Vance, Elena. Woe 1. The analysts are saying the thermal bloom wasn't just the explosives, a voice said from the shadows of the office. Sterling didn't look up. He knew the voice. It belonged to Miller, the real Miller, the one who had spent the last decade running the black side of the Signal Corps. They're saying the signal itself provided the kinetic energy, Miller continued, stepping into the circle of light from the desk lamp. She turned the mountain into a capacitor. When the bombs hit, she didn't just let them explode, she focused the discharge. She used the physical impact to hammer the signal into the ground. It's some kind of high-level energy manipulation we don't even have a name for yet. Sterling finally looked up. His eyes were tired, the skin around them sagging like old parchment. She's a woman, Miller, not a god. She's a warrant officer with a hearing disability and a history of insubordination. She's the only reason the Western Seaboard still has a functional electrical grid, Miller said. He threw a stack of data sheets onto the desk. Look at the telemetry from the Idaho towers. The moment she grounded that signal, the vagabond virus vanished. Not just from our systems, but from every consumer device between Boise and Salt Lake. She didn't just stop it, she purged it. And in doing so, she destroyed a billion-dollar research facility and the career of one of my best colonels, Sterling snapped. Holloway was a fanatic, Miller said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He was trying to weaponize something he didn't understand. He was playing with the fundamental resonance of the planet, General. Elena Vance saw the cliff he was driving us over, and she grabbed the wheel. You can call it insubordination if you want, but the history books, if they are ever allowed to be written, will call it salvation. Sterling picked up his glass and drained it. The bourbon burned, a familiar grounding sensation. The history books won't be written, not about this. The official story is a gas leak in the primary cooling system. The explosion was accidental. Vance is a survivor being treated for trauma. That's the line. That's the only line that keeps the panic from starting. And if she won't take the line? Sterling looked at the satellite photo of the glass mountain. Then we treat her like any other contaminated asset. We contain her until she's no longer a threat. She's not the threat, Richard, Miller said, moving toward the door. The threat is that we're so afraid of what she can do that we're willing to kill the only person who can protect us from what's coming next. The Gray 7 signal wasn't a one-time event. It was a knock on the door, and Elena Vance is the only one who knows how to answer it. The door closed, leaving Sterling alone with the silence of his office. He looked at the file on his desk. He thought about the board meeting tomorrow. He thought about the woman in room 402. He felt a sudden, sharp chill, the kind of cold that doesn't come from the air conditioner. It was the cold of a man who realized he was holding a tiger by the tail and had no idea how to let go without being eaten. Back at Walter Reed, the night was a slow, agonizing crawl. Elena didn't sleep. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the rhythm of the mountain. It was fainter now, a ghost of a sound, but it was still there, pulsing in the marrow of her teeth. She stood up and walked to the small sink in the corner of the room. She splashed cold water on her face, the liquid shocking her back into the present. She looked at herself in the mirror. She barely recognized the woman staring back. Her hair was cropped short, flecked with gray that hadn't been there a month ago. There was a thin, jagged scar running from her jawline to her collarbone, a permanent reminder of the day the light had tried to consume her. But it was her eyes that were different. They were clear, preternaturally still, the eyes of someone who had seen the bottom of the ocean and realized it wasn't dark. It was just waiting. She felt a sudden, sharp pressure in her chest. It wasn't physical. It was a pull, a tether. She closed her eyes and focused on the silence in her right ear. She didn't try to hear the world. She tried to hear the asterisk gap asterisk. Asterisk L, asterisk the word wasn't spoken. It was a vibration, a specific frequency that matched the beating of her own heart. Asterisk Sully. Asterisk Elena's fingers gripped the edge of the sink until her knuckles turned white. She was 300 miles away from the Tacoma, locked in a high-security wing of a military hospital, and yet she could feel her friend. She could feel the anxiety, the sharp, jagged edge of Sully's fear. She could feel the way Sully was sitting in a darkened room, her hand resting on a cold piece of metal, the thumb drive. Asterisk don't do it, Sully, asterisk Elena thought, her mind projecting the words into the void. Asterisk don't come for me. Not yet. Asterisk but the tether didn't loosen. If anything, it tightened. Sully was moving. She was in a car. The sound of a highway, the specific low-frequency hum of tires on asphalt leaked through the connection. Sully was coming to D.C. She was coming to the board. Elena opened her eyes, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She wasn't just a woman with a hidden capability. She was a node in a network that the Army didn't have the codes for. The ear hadn't been destroyed by the blast. It had been calibrated. She sat back down on the bed, her mind racing. She had 12 hours before the inquiry. 12 hours before they tried to make her disappear. She needed to move. She needed to get out of this box, not for her own safety, but to stop Sully from walking into a trap she couldn't see. She looked at the ceiling, at the smoke detector and the recessed sprinkler head. She could hear the electrical current running through the walls. It was a complex, multi-layered song. The security cameras were on a dedicated circuit. The electronic door lock was on another. The emergency lighting was on a third. She didn't need a key. She didn't need a weapon. She just needed a note. She stood up and walked to the wall next to the door. She pressed her hand against the smooth, painted drywall. She could feel the copper wiring beneath the surface, the pulse of the building's nervous system. She began to hum, a low, guttural sound that started in the base of her throat. It wasn't the middle C this time. It was something sharper, a discordant, high-pitched frequency that she had learned from the vault's cooling fans. She pushed the sound into the wall. She felt the resistance, the insulation of the building trying to dampen the vibration. She pushed harder, her entire body beginning to tremble with the effort. The lights in the room flickered. The hum of the fluorescent bulb shifted, rising in pitch until it became a scream. In the security station down the hall, a young corporal frowned as his monitors began to snowflake. "Hey, Sarge, I think we've got a power surge in the 400 wing. Check the breakers," the sergeant grunted, not looking up from his coffee. "This building is older than my grandmother. The wiring is junk." The corporal reached for the console, but before his fingers could touch the buttons, the screen erupted in a shower of sparks. The smell of burning ozone filled the air. Elena felt the surge hit the door lock. It was a sharp, mechanical asterisk thunk asterisk, the sound of a solenoid being forced open by a spike in voltage. She stepped back as the heavy steel door drifted open an inch. She didn't run. She didn't panic. She waited for her heart rate to settle, for the ear to give her the layout of the hallway. Asterisk one guard at the end of the corridor, standing near the elevator. He's listening to a podcast. His breathing is steady. He's bored. Asterisk Elena stepped out into the hallway, her bare feet silent on the cold linoleum. She moved with the fluid, predatory grace of a ghost. She didn't look at the cameras. She knew they were blind. She focused on the guard. She was 20 feet away when he turned. His eyes widened, his hand moving toward the holster at his hip. "Hey, stop right there. Vance, get back in your—" Elena didn't let him finish. She didn't use her fists. She used the environment. She reached out and gripped the metal railing of the fire extinguisher cabinet. She channeled a burst of that same high-frequency resonance into the metal. The guard, whose hand was on the steel frame of the elevator door, suddenly jerked. His body seizing as a non-lethal but paralyzing electrical arc jumped from the wall to his arm. He slumped to the floor, his eyes rolling back in his head. Elena caught him before he hit the ground, lowering him gently to the floor. She felt no malice toward him. He was just a man on a shift, a small part of a machine that didn't know it was broken. She took his security badge and his radio, then stepped into the elevator. She didn't go to the lobby. She went to the basement, the service tunnels that connected the annex to the main hospital. As the elevator descended, Elena felt the weight of the building above her. She felt the thousands of people sleeping, dreaming, dying. She felt the immense, crushing pressure of the institution. She was one woman against a fortress, but for the first time in years she wasn't afraid. She knew exactly what she was. She was the ground, and the ground never breaks. Outside the D.C., night was thick with humidity and the smell of exhaust. Elena emerged from a laundry vent behind the hospital, the cool air hitting her face like a benediction. She was wearing a stolen lab coat over her gray tracksuit, her feet shoved into a pair of discarded surgical clogs. She looked like just another overworked resident, another soul lost in the machinery of the city. She started walking. She didn't have a destination, but she had a direction. She could feel the tether. Sully was close. While Elena moved through the shadows of the capital, the reckoning was beginning in a place she couldn't see. In a suburban house in Alexandria, Colonel Holloway's widow, Sarah, was sitting at her kitchen table. She had been told her husband was a hero. She had been told he had died preventing a catastrophe. She had been given a folded flag and a letter from the Secretary of the Army. But she was looking at a laptop screen that showed something different. The screen was filled with video files, raw, unedited footage from the vault's internal security system. Someone had sent them to her an hour ago. No message, no explanation, just the files. Sarah watched as her husband, the man she had loved for 20 years, ordered his men to fire on a woman who was trying to save them. She watched him scream about owning the frequency. She watched the madness in his eyes as the blue light of the conduits consumed him. She didn't cry. She sat in the silence of her empty house, the weight of the lie settling onto her chest like a tombstone. Her husband wasn't a hero. He was a casualty of his own ambition, a man who had traded his soul for a secret that didn't belong to him. She looked at the sender's address. It was a string of random numbers and letters. "Who are you?" She whispered to the empty room. The laptop pinged. A single line of text appeared on the screen. Asterisk tell the story. Asterisk Sarah Halloway closed the laptop. She looked at the folded flag on the mantelpiece, the symbol of the institution that had lied to her to protect its own image. She reached out and picked up the phone. She didn't call the army. She called a number she had seen on the back of a business card 3 years ago, a reporter for the Washington Post who specialized in institutional failures. The machinery was starting to grind, but it wasn't grinding the way General Sterling had intended. The truth was a frequency, and once it was broadcast, it was impossible to pull back out of the air. At 0300, Elena found the motel. It was a low-rent dive on the edge of the Anacostia, the kind of place where people went to disappear. She stood in the parking lot, the sound of the city a dull roar in the distance. She walked to room 114. She didn't knock. She just stood by the door and waited. The door opened 10 seconds later. Sully stood there, a 9mm Beretta in her hand, her eyes red-rimmed and wild. She looked like she hadn't slept since the mountain blew. When she saw Elena, the gun didn't drop. Her hand began to shake, the metal clattering against the doorframe. Sully whispered. "Is it really you?" "It's me, Sully," Elena said. Sully stepped back, letting her into the room. The space was cramped and smelled of stale tobacco. On the bed was the Pelican case, open and glowing with the light of a ruggedized laptop. Next to it, Scout was lying on the floor, his tail thumping once against the carpet. He didn't jump up. He just watched Elena with his amber eyes, his ears twitching as if he could hear the static still clinging to her clothes. "I thought they'd killed you," Sully said, her voice breaking. "The news said the facility was lost. They said there were no survivors. I only knew you were alive because I could feel you. I thought I was going crazy, El. I thought the signal had finally broken my brain." "The signal didn't break you," Elena said, walking over to Scout and resting her hand on his head. The dog let out a long, shuddering sigh and leaned into her. "It just opened a door, and we can't close it." "They're following me," Sully said, looking toward the window. "I've swapped plates 3 times, but they're always there. Black subs, men in suits who look like they're made of stone. They want this drive, El. They want it more than anything." "I know," Elena said. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the screen. The data from the vault was scrolling past. The vagabond logs, the frequency maps, the internal memos from Halloway to Sterling. It was the blueprint of a conspiracy that reached all the way to the top of the E-ring. "What do we do?" Sully asked. "We can't just give it to them. If we do, they'll just bury it. They'll make sure no one ever finds out what Halloway was doing." "We're not giving it to them," Elena said. "But we're not running anymore either." "Then what?" "We're going to the board," Elena said. "General Sterling wants an inquiry. We're going to give him one, but we're not going as defendants. We're going as the evidence." Sully looked at her, and for the first time she saw the shift in Elena. She saw the clarity, the quiet, terrifying competence of a woman who had moved beyond the need for validation. "You're going to get yourself killed," Sully said. "Maybe," Elena replied. "But I've already died once in that mountain. The rest of this is just overtime." The personal cost was arriving in full now. Elena could feel her body failing, the adrenaline of the escape wearing off and leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. Her right ear was throbbing, a sharp, rhythmic pain that told her the damage was permanent. She would never hear the world the same way again. She would always be half-balanced, always leaning into the silence. And Sully had lost her career, her home, her sense of safety. She was a fugitive because she had been loyal to a friend. The cost was written in the lines around her mouth, in the way she flinched at the sound of a car passing in the street. But as they sat in that dingy motel room, the thumb drive glowing like a blue coal between them, there was something else. A flicker of hope. Not the movie kind of hope, not a bright, shining light, but a small, stubborn spark. The kind of hope that survives in the dark because it has nowhere else to go. "We need to get you some clothes," Sully said, wiping her eyes. "You can't go to the Pentagon in a stolen lab coat and clogs." "I have my dress blues in the truck," Elena said. "I grabbed them before we left the proving ground. I figured if I was going to go down, I was going to go down in uniform." Sully smiled, a small, genuine thing. "Always the soldier, El." "Always the mission," Elena replied. They spent the next 4 hours preparing. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. They moved with the practiced efficiency of a team that had been through the fire and come out the other side. Sully prepped the drive, setting up a dead man's switch that would broadcast the data to 20 different news outlets if she didn't check in every 6 hours. Elena sat in the chair, her eyes closed, listening to the city. She could hear the shift in the atmosphere as the sun began to rise. She could hear the city waking up, the buses, the sirens, the heartbeat of the capital, and beneath it all she could hear the Pentagon. It sounded like a massive, low-frequency drum, a rhythmic thrumming of power and secrets. She stood up and put on the dress blues. The wool was heavy, the metals clinking softly as she pinned them to her chest. She looked at the rank insignia on her shoulders, the single bar of a warrant officer. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had earned it. She looked at Sully, who was dressed in a dark suit she'd bought at a thrift store in Ohio. "Ready?" Elena asked. Sully picked up the Pelican case and nodded. "Ready." They left the motel as the first light of dawn was hitting the Potomac. The silver Tacoma was parked 2 blocks away, hidden under a tarp. They drove toward Virginia, the truck a ghost in the morning traffic. As they crossed the 14th Street Bridge, Elena looked out at the Pentagon. The massive, 5-sided building sat like a fortress on the hill, its windows reflecting the pale orange light of the sun. It looked invincible. It looked like the kind of place where the truth went to die. Elena felt the ear twitch. The resonance was building. Asterisk 1, 2, 3. Asterisk the pulse was still there. It wasn't the other side anymore. It was her. She was the rhythm. They reached the security checkpoint at the Pentagon South parking lot. A young MP stepped out of the booth, his hand on his holster. "ID and authorization," he said, his voice bored. Elena handed him her military ID. She didn't look away. She didn't blink. The MP looked at the ID, then at Elena. He looked at the dress blues, the medals, the scar on her neck. He looked at the computer screen in his booth. Elena could hear the heartbeat of the computer. She could hear the red alert flashing on the MP's screen. Asterisk Vance, Elena, detention order 402A, notify command immediately. Asterisk the MP's hand tightened on his weapon. He looked up, his face pale. "Warrant Officer Vance," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the vehicle." "I'm not here to step out," Elena said, her voice calm and cold. "I'm here for my hearing, room 3E80. General Sterling is expecting me." The MP hesitated. He looked at the Tacoma, then at the security cameras. He was a 20-year-old kid from Ohio, and he was staring into the eyes of a woman who had just survived a mountain collapse. "Ma'am, I have orders to." "Your orders are to maintain the security of this facility," Elena interrupted. "And right now, the most secure thing you can do is let me through that gate. Because if you don't, the story that's currently sitting on a server in 20 different newsrooms is going to go live. And when it does, the man who gave you those orders isn't going to be around to protect you." The silence in the parking lot was absolute. The MP looked at Elena, then at Sully, who was holding the Pelican case like a bomb. He stepped back. He didn't say a word. He just pressed the button, and the heavy steel gate slid open. "Thank you, Corporal," Elena said. They drove through. The Pentagon was a maze of corridors and echoes. Elena led the way, her boots clicking on the polished floors. They didn't hide. They walked straight through the heart of the beast, past colonels and generals, past analysts and aides. People stopped and stared. They saw the woman in the dress blues, the woman whose face was on every classified bulletin in the building, and they didn't know what to do. They reached the E-ring. They reached room 3E80. 2 MPs were standing outside the door, their rifles held at the low-ready. They stepped forward as Elena approached. "No unauthorized entry," one of them said. "I'm Elena Vance," she said. "I'm the reason this room exists today." The door opened from the inside. Miller stood there, his face a mask of neutral professionality. He looked at Elena, then at the MPs. "Let her in," he said. The room was large and windowless, dominated by a massive mahogany table. General Sterling sat at the head of the table, surrounded by 4 other generals and a team of JAG lawyers. They all looked up as Elena entered. The air in the room was thick with the smell of old paper and expensive cologne. It was the smell of power. Elena walked to the end of the table and stopped. She didn't salute. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, her hands behind her back, her eyes fixed on Sterling. Sully stood behind her, the Pelican case resting on the table. Sterling looked at Elena for a long time. The silence in the room was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on everyone present. "You're late, Warrant Officer," Sterling finally said. "I had to find my uniform," Elena replied. Sterling leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "You realize that by being here, you are effectively surrendering yourself to the custody of the United States Army. You have violated every protocol of your medical leave. You have breached a secure facility. You have. I have saved the grid, Elena said, and I have brought the receipts. She gestured to Sully, who opened the Pelican case and turned the laptop around. The screen showed the first page of the Vagabond logs. It showed Holloway's signature. It showed the date of the first signal 3 years before the public was told it existed. We're not here to argue about my career, General, Elena said. We're here to talk about what's coming next, because the signal isn't gone. It's just waiting, and if you keep trying to hide the truth, you're not going to have a grid to protect next time. The room erupted. The JAG lawyers began to shout about classified information and treason. The generals began to argue about the chain of command. But Sterling didn't move. He looked at the screen, then at Elena. He saw the scar on her neck. He saw the stillness in her eyes. And for the first time in his 40-year career, General Richard Sterling felt a flicker of genuine, unadulterated fear. Not the fear of a war or a bomb. The fear of a person who realized they were no longer the most powerful thing in the room. Elena felt it too. She felt the resonance of the room shift. She felt the ear pick up a new frequency, a low, rhythmic tapping coming from the vent above her head. Asterisk 1, 2, 3. Asterisk, she looked up. The signal wasn't waiting. It was already here. Shut it down, Sterling whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise. Vance, shut it down. I can't, Elena said, her voice a calm, devastating truth. I'm not the one broadcasting it anymore. The lights in the room flickered. The digital clocks on the wall began to spin backward. The laptops of the JAG lawyers erupted in static. The reckoning had arrived, and it hadn't come for Elena, it had come for the institution. Elena looked at Sully, who was gripping the edge of the table. She looked at Miller, who was standing by the door, his hand on his heart, and then she looked at Sterling. You wanted to know the cost, General? She asked. This is it. This is what it costs to be right in a world that only wants to be safe. The sound in the room became deafening, a roar of white noise that felt like a physical hammer. Elena stood in the center of it, her head held high, her eyes clear. She wasn't grounding the signal this time. She was letting it speak. The door to the room buckled. The walls began to vibrate with a frequency that threatened to shake the Pentagon to its foundations. What do we do? Someone screamed. Elena Vance didn't answer. She didn't have to. She simply closed her eyes and listened to the sound of the world being unmade. And in that moment, in the heart of the most powerful building on Earth, the only person who wasn't afraid was the woman who had already lost everything. The resolution was coming, but it wouldn't be a medal, it wouldn't be a court-martial, it would be something much more permanent. Elena felt the tether pull one last time. Asterisk ready, L. Asterisk, asterisk ready. Asterisk the silver signet ring on General Sterling's right hand. A 1974 West Point class ring with a worn-down stone started to chatter against the mahogany table at exactly 0814. It was a tiny, frantic sound, a metallic woodpecker drilling into the silence of room 3E80, and it was the first thing to break as the Pentagon's electrical spine began to twist. Elena watched the ring. She watched the way the general's hand shook, not with fear yet, but with the sheer physical pressure of the frequency as it surged up through the floorboards and into the marrow of his bones. The smell of ozone, sharp and cold like a winter storm hitting a power line, filled the windowless room, erasing the scent of stale coffee and expensive wool. For Elena, the sensation wasn't an intrusion. It was a homecoming. Her right ear, the one packed with surgical gauze and taped shut, didn't feel deaf anymore. It felt like a pressurized chamber about to blow. She could hear the building screaming before the machines did. She could hear the cooling fans in the server room 3 floors down seizing up, their bearings melting in a synchronized chorus of failure. The light in the room didn't just flicker, it curdled. The bright, sterile LEDs shifted into a bruised purple, the spectrum of light bending under the weight of a magnetic field that shouldn't have existed. Across the table, a JAG colonel reached for his tablet, but the device hissed, a spiderweb of cracks blooming across the screen as the lithium battery groaned. The air was thick enough to chew. It felt like standing in the middle of a desert during a lightning strike, every hair on Elena's arm standing straight up, her skin prickling with a static charge that tasted like copper and old blood. She stood perfectly still in her dress blues, her hands clasped behind her back, the single bar on her shoulder reflecting the dying light. She was the only thing in the room that wasn't vibrating. She was the ground. "Shut it down, Vance," Sterling repeated, his voice straining against the roar of the white noise that only Elena could fully interpret. He tried to stand, but his knees buckled as the resonance hit a harmonic frequency that messed with the fluid in his inner ear. He slumped back into his leather chair, his face turning a gray, doughy color. "That's an order. Ground the signal or I'll have the MPs put a bullet in your head right here." Elena didn't look at him. She looked at Sully, who was standing 4 feet behind her, gripping the Pelican case like a life raft. Sully's eyes were wide, the pupils blown out, her breathing coming in the short, jagged gasps of someone experiencing a panic attack. But she didn't move. She didn't run. She looked at Elena and saw the absolute, terrifying stillness there, and she anchored herself to it. "I'm not the one doing this, General," Elena said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the electrical roar like a knife through silk. "The signal isn't an attack, it's a broadcast. You spent 20 years trying to build a cage for a ghost, and all you did was give it a megaphone. You can kill me. You can kill everyone in this room. It won't stop the transmission. The Gray 7 isn't in the wires anymore. It's in the air. It's in the ground. It's in us." She felt the surge peak. It was a physical blow, a wall of energy that slammed into her chest and pushed her back an inch. The mahogany table split down the middle with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot, the wood splintering under the torque of the magnetic field. In the hallway, she could hear the heavy steel security doors slamming shut as the fail-safes engaged, locking them into a tomb of their own making. The Pentagon was going dark, section by section, as the vagabond virus. The thing Holloway had tried to tame unspooled itself from the classified servers and began to speak to every device in the building. Outside the room, the world was already changing. 3 miles away, in a newsroom at the Washington Post, a reporter named David Miller sat staring at his monitor as a series of files began to download themselves. They weren't coming from an email. They were just appearing line by line on his desktop. The Holloway memos, the thermal imaging of the Stansbury strike, the audio recordings of Elena Vance's first contact with the frequency. The ear wasn't just disrupting the Pentagon, it was acting as a bridge, a high-speed conduit between the secrets buried in the mountain and the world that needed to know they existed. Elena closed her eyes. She stopped fighting the pressure in her head and let the ear open all the way. The silence in her right ear evaporated, replaced by a symphony of data. She could hear the heartbeat of the city. She could hear the panic in the security sub-basement. She could hear the specific, low-frequency hum of a satellite moving into position overhead. And she could hear the Gray 7. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't an enemy. It was a mathematical truth, a fundamental resonance of the planet that had been disturbed by the military's experiments. It was trying to find its way back to zero. "I can stabilize it," Elena whispered, her eyes still closed. "But you have to let go of the drive, General. You have to let the data go live. You try to keep it, and this building becomes a funeral pyre." Sterling was gasping now, his hand clutching his chest. He looked at the other generals in the room. They were frozen, terrified men who had spent their lives commanding armies and were now being defeated by a sound they couldn't even hear. One of them, a 3-star from the Air Force, was weeping silently, the high-frequency vibration rattling his teeth until his gums began to bleed. "Do it," Miller, the man from the shadows, said from the doorway. He was the only one besides Elena who seemed to understand the scale of the catastrophe. He was leaning against the doorframe, his suit jacket smoking where it touched the metal. "Let it go, Richard. It's over. The mountain is gone. The project is dead. Save the building." Sterling looked at the Pelican case on the table. He looked at Sully. For a moment, his eyes flared with a desperate, dying pride, the look of a man who would rather see the world burn than admit he was wrong. Then the fluorescent lights overhead exploded in a rain of glass and white powder. The room went pitch black, illuminated only by the blue, ghostly glow of the ear as it manifested around Elena's head like a halo of static. "Let it go," Sterling croaked. Sully didn't wait for a second command. She hit the final key on the ruggedized laptop. The enter key didn't just send a file. It felt like a release valve being opened. The pressure in the room vanished instantly. The roar of the noise dropped to a whisper, then to a low, melodic thrum. The lights didn't come back on, but the emergency red glow of the backup system kicked in, painting the room in the color of a sunset. Elena felt the ear withdraw, the sensation like a cold hand being lifted from her brain. She swayed, her knees hitting the floor, her hands catching her weight on the splintered remains of the table. Silence returned to room 3E80. It was a heavy, traumatized silence, the kind that follows a massive explosion before the survivors start to scream. Elena knelt there, her head bowed, her breath coming in long, shuddering pulls. Her right ear was bleeding, a thin trickle of dark red running down her neck and staining the white collar of her dress shirt. She felt hollow. She felt like a bell that had been struck so hard it would never stop ringing, even if the sound was now too high for anyone to hear. General Sterling sat in his chair, his hands trembling. He looked like an old man, just an old man in a costume that didn't fit anymore. He didn't look at Elena. He didn't look at the files. He looked at the wreckage of the room and realized that his legacy was now a series of redacted lines in a story he no longer controlled. "Get her out of here," Sterling said, his voice paper-thin. "Get them both out, before I change my mind." Miller stepped forward, his face unreadable. He walked over to Elena and offered her a hand. She didn't take it. She pushed herself up, her movements slow and deliberate, the ghost of the soldier she used to be still providing the structure for her spine. She looked at Sully, who was already closing the Pelican case, her hands shaking so hard the latches wouldn't catch. Elena reached out and covered Sully's hand with her own. "It's okay," Elena said. "It's done." They walked out of the room, past the stunned MPs, past the smoking server racks and the darkened offices of the most powerful military in the world. They walked through the corridors of the Pentagon as the morning sun began to bleed through the high windows, lighting up the dust motes that danced in the air. People were emerging from their offices, their faces pale, their phones finally working again as the vagabond virus retreated into the shadows of the internet. No one stopped them. No one spoke to them. They were ghosts moving through a graveyard. They reached the south parking lot and found the Tacoma exactly where they had left it. Scout was sitting in the back, his head resting on the edge of the truck bed, his tail thumping once as they approached. He didn't bark. He just watched Elena with those deep amber eyes, seeing the things the humans couldn't. Sully climbed into the driver's seat and sat there for a long time, her forehead resting against the steering wheel. Elena sat in the passenger seat, the weight of the dress blues suddenly unbearable. She began to unpin the medals one by one. The Bronze Star, the Commendation Medal with Valor, the ribbons for tours in places she barely remembered. She put them in the glove box and shut it. "Where are we going?" Sully asked, her voice small. Elena looked out at the Potomac, the water sparkling in the early light. She thought about the mountain. She thought about the silence that was waiting for her on the other side of this. "West," Elena said, "as far as we can get." The cost of the victory wasn't tallied in a court-martial or a medal ceremony. It was tallied in the weeks that followed, in the quiet, agonizing process of disappearing. The military didn't hunt them. They didn't have to. The scandal that broke over the next month, the Holloway leak, as the papers called it, was so catastrophic that the Pentagon was too busy cauterizing its own wounds to worry about a disgraced warrant officer and a civilian contractor. The official report said that Elena Vance had been discharged for medical reasons following the unfortunate accident at the Stansbury Proving Ground. Her pension was processed. Her record was scrubbed of the domestic terrorist flags. She was given a check, a handshake from a man she'd never met, and a set of orders that forbid her from ever stepping foot on a military installation again. It was a clean break, the kind of surgical separation the Army used when a limb was too gangrenous to save. They settled in a small town in Wyoming, 3 hours north of Casper, a place where the wind never stopped blowing and the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. It was a house made of cedar and stone, perched on the edge of a valley that looked like a scar on the earth. There were no cell towers for 20 miles, no high-speed internet, no smart devices. The only electricity came from a small solar array and a backup generator that Elena had modified to run at a frequency that didn't hurt her head. The first month was the hardest. The ear didn't go away, it just changed. Without the constant hum of the military's signals, the world became preternaturally loud in a different way. Elena could hear the grass growing. She could hear the tectonic plates of the Rockies grinding against each other 100 miles down. She could hear the migration patterns of birds in the upper atmosphere. It was a constant, overwhelming flood of information that threatened to drown her. She spent her days working on the land. She cleared brush. She fixed the fence. She dug a well by hand, her muscles hardening, her skin turning the color of the Wyoming soil. She didn't talk much. She didn't need to. Sully was there, living in the small cabin 100 yards away, the two of them bound together by a shared trauma that didn't have a name. They had earned their silence. Sully had changed too. The sharp, nervous energy she'd carried for years had been replaced by a quiet, watchful stillness. She spent her days training Scout and working on a book that she would never publish, a history of things that weren't supposed to exist. They saw each other for dinner every night, sitting on the porch as the sun went down, the only sound the clinking of forks and the distant cry of a hawk. One evening in October, as the first frost was beginning to turn the valley silver, a car drove up the long, gravel driveway. It wasn't a black SUV. It was a battered Ford Taurus, its muffler hanging low, its windshield cracked. Elena stood up from the porch swing, her hand instinctively moving to the small of her back where she no longer carried a weapon. Scout stood beside her, his hackles rising, a low growl vibrating in his chest. A man got out of the car. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, his hair longer than it had been at the Pentagon, his face lined with the exhaustion of a man who had seen too much of the truth. It was Miller. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at Elena. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at her, seeing the scar on her neck, the gray in her hair, the calluses on her hands. "You're hard to find, Elena," he said. "That was the point," she replied. Miller leaned against the fender of his car. "Sterling is gone, forced retirement. The board is being restructured. They're calling it the Vance Reform, a whole new set of protocols for signal intelligence. No more weapons research on the gray frequencies." "I don't care, Miller," Elena said. "I did my job, I'm out." "I know," Miller said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. He walked up the steps and held it out to her. It was a coin. Not a military challenge coin, but a small silver disc with a single embossed image on it, a radio tower standing in a field of wheat. "What's this?" "A reminder," Miller said. "There are people in D.C. who haven't forgotten, people who know that the grid is still up because of you. We can't give you a medal, Elena. We can't even give you a thank you in a public forum, but we wanted you to have this." Elena looked at the coin. She felt the weight of it in her palm, a cold, solid thing. She thought about the mountain. She thought about the way the light had felt as it consumed Holloway. She thought about the moment she had decided that the mission mattered more than her life. "How is the world, Miller?" she asked. Miller sighed, looking out over the valley. "It's messy. The leak caused a lot of problems. People are scared. They don't trust the narrative anymore, but for the first time in a long time, the lights are staying on because they're supposed to, not because we're holding a gun to the planet's head." "Good," Elena said. She handed the coin back to him. "Keep it," she said. "I don't need a reminder. I hear it every morning." Miller looked at the coin, then at her. He nodded slowly, a look of profound respect crossing his face. He pocketed the coin and turned back to his car. "If you ever need anything, Elena, anything at all, you know how to reach me." "I won't need anything," she said. She watched him drive away, the dust of the road rising in a long, golden plume behind him. She stood on the porch until the sound of the engine had faded into the background noise of the wind. Sully came out of the house, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She stood next to Elena, her shoulder brushing against hers. "Who was that?" "Just a man who forgot that some things aren't meant to be owned," Elena said. They stood there as the stars began to poke through the deepening blue of the sky. In Wyoming, the stars aren't just points of light. They're a thick, shimmering carpet that feels close enough to touch. For most people, the silence of the high plains is a void. For Elena, it was a conversation. She could hear the rotation of the earth. She could hear the faint, rhythmic pulse of the ionosphere as it reacted to the solar wind. Asterisk 1, 2, 3. Asterisk, it was still there. It would always be there. The ear hadn't been a curse, and it hadn't been a gift. It was just a sense, a way of perceiving the truth that most people were too busy to notice. She had been chosen for it not because she was special, but because she was the only one who had been willing to listen when the world started to scream. The cost had been her hearing, her career, and the life she had imagined for herself when she was a 20-year-old recruit at Fort Meade. She would never go back to the world of orders and ranks and classified briefings. She would never wear the dress blues again. She was a woman without a country, a soldier without an army, a ghost living in a house of stone. But as she stood on that porch, the cold wind biting at her cheeks, Elena felt a sudden, sharp surge of relief. She wasn't holding anything back anymore. She wasn't grounding the signal. She was just existing in it. She looked at Sully. "You want to go for a walk? It's freezing, El." "The air is clear," Elena said. "I want to hear the ridge." Sully smiled and pulled the blanket tighter. "Okay, let's hear the ridge." They walked down the porch steps and out into the tall grass. Scout ran ahead of them, his tail a white flag in the darkness. They walked toward the edge of the valley, toward the place where the earth dropped away into the shadows. Elena stopped at the rim. She closed her eyes. She didn't try to hear the satellites or the servers or the secrets of men. She just listened to the mountain. Not the one she had destroyed, but the ones that were still standing. The ones that had been here for 1 billion years and would be here for 1 billion more. She felt the resonance of the granite beneath her feet. It was a deep, steady thrum, a heartbeat that didn't need a frequency. It was the sound of the world being okay. It was the sound of the ground holding firm. She thought about the thousands of people in Wisdom, Montana, who were sleeping in their beds, their heaters running, their lights off, their lives continuing in the quiet, unremarkable way that real lives do. They would never know her name. They would never know about the vault or the Gray Seven or the woman who had stood in the path of a lightning bolt to save them. And that was exactly how it should be. A hero isn't the person who gets the medal. A hero is the person who pays the price so that the rest of the world doesn't have to know there was a price to pay. Elena reached out and took Sully's hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. They stood at the edge of the world, 2 women and a dog, survivors of a war that had never been declared and would never be ended. Elena felt the ear twitch one last time. It wasn't a signal, it was just a breath. She opened her eyes and looked at the horizon. The first hint of the moon was rising over the peaks, casting a pale, silver glow over the valley. It was beautiful. It was silent. It was true. She realized then that she didn't need to listen for the other side anymore. She was already there. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The weight of the last 15 years, the secrets, the lies, the noise, fell away from her, leaving behind something clean and hard and permanent. She was Elena Vance. She had been a soldier. She had been a ghost. She had been a conduit. And now she was just a woman standing in the wind. She took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs, the smell of pine and dry earth and coming snow sharp and sweet in her nose. She squeezed Sully's hand and felt the answering pressure. They turned and started the long walk back to the house, their shadows stretching out behind them in the moonlight. Scout circled back, his breath a white mist in the air, his ears pricked for a sound that only he and Elena could understand. The house was waiting for them, a small point of light in the vast, dark emptiness of the Wyoming night. It didn't look like much. It didn't look like a fortress. But as Elena walked toward it, she knew it was the strongest thing she had ever built. She reached the porch and paused, looking back one last time at the mountains. The silence wasn't a hole. It was a promise. She stepped inside and closed the door, the heavy oak clicking shut with a sound that was final and right. She walked to the kitchen and turned on the stove to make tea. The small blue flame flickered to life, a steady, controlled heat in the center of the room. She watched the light dance on the copper kettle, the reflection bright and clear in her good eye. Sully sat at the table and opened a book. Scout curled up by the fire, his head resting on his paws. Elena stood by the window and looked out at the dark. She could hear the kettle starting to hum, a low, domestic G-natural that matched the vibration of her own heart. She didn't need to translate it. She didn't need to ground it, she just needed to hear it. She felt the scar on her neck, the jagged line of it, a permanent map of where she had been. It didn't hurt anymore. It was just part of the landscape. The world was still turning. The grid was still holding. The secrets were still there, buried in the mountains and the servers, but they were no longer her burden to carry. She had given them back to the people they belonged to. She poured the tea, the steam rising in a soft, white cloud. She handed a mug to Sully and took her own to the chair by the fire. She sat down and let the warmth of the mug seep into her hands. She closed her eyes and let the ear go quiet, really quiet, for the first time since she was a girl in Billings. She wasn't a soldier anymore. She wasn't an asset. She wasn't a hero. She was just Elena. And for the first time in her life, the silence was enough. Outside, the Wyoming wind continued to howl, a long, mournful sound that echoed through the empty valleys and over the high, jagged peaks. It blew over the ruins of the Stansbury Mountain. It blew over the glass-covered craters of the proving ground. It blew over the headstones of men who had died for secrets that were now just lines in a newspaper. But it didn't touch the house. The house stood firm, a small, stubborn spark of life in the middle of the great, wide dark. Elena took a sip of her tea and felt the warmth spread through her chest. She looked at Scout, whose ears were twitching in his sleep. She looked at Sully, who was turning a page in her book. She felt the weight of the world, and it was light. The mission was over. The report would say she was gone, but the report was wrong. She was right here. She put her feet up on the hearth and watched the embers of the fire glow, a deep, pulsing red that looked like the heart of the earth itself. She didn't need to hear anything else. The truth was a quiet thing, and she had finally found the frequency. Everything she had done had cost her something, but as she sat there in the silence of her own home, she knew she would pay it all again. The lights stayed on. Elena Vance closed her eyes and went to sleep. The only thing she heard was her own breathing, steady and slow and true.